She stepped off the stagecoach in the wrong coat for the weather, the wrong boots for the mud, and a hat with frozen flowers that a dog stole before she reached the ground. She fell into a water trough in front of the entire town. And in doing so, she made a man laugh who had not laughed in 1,014 days. This is the story of what happened next. She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting at the platform. No house visible on the horizon. Just three bearded mountain men she had never seen 100 miles of Wyoming wilderness, pressing down on every side, and a letter tucked against her heart that had promised her a home. The letter had told her someone needed her. The letter had described mountains so beautiful they made a man believe in something larger than himself. The letter had been written by a hand she would never get to hold. And the man standing 40 feet away, in the frozen mud of Stone Creek's main street, watching her with amber eyes that carried the permanent weight of someone who had already decided the best part of his life was finished, had not written a single word of it. But that is where the story begins. Not with the letter, not with the lie. With the moment everything changed, because a woman from Boston who could not cross 5 feet of flat ground without tripping over something fell headfirst into a water trough on a Tuesday morning in February and made a man laugh for the first time in 1,014 days. Some stories start gently. This one started with a splash. Before we go any further, if you are new here, take a moment and subscribe. I share new frontier stories every single week, and I would love for you to be part of this. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. Now let us go back to Stone Creek, Wyoming territory in the winter of 1878. Ruth Langley ran the general store in Stone Creek, and she knew everybody's business whether they wanted her to or not. She had been knowing everybody's business for 22 years, since the day she and her late husband Abraham had nailed the first boards of that store into the frozen Wyoming ground and decided against considerable evidence to the contrary that this was where they intended to build a life. Ruth kept a calendar behind her counter. Most merchants kept calendars for ordering and accounting. Ruth Langley kept hers for something quieter and more private. Every morning before she unlocked the front door and before she lit the first lamp, she would take the calendar down from its nail and mark a small letter X in the corner of the day's square. She had been marking those X's for a long time. 1,014 days to be exact, though she had stopped counting at that number. Not because Silas Harrow had smiled, because the counting itself had started to feel like measuring the depth of a well that had no bottom, and some measurements are too cruel to keep taking. Silas Harrow was 30 years old. He stood 6 feet and 4 inches in his boots, built the way frontier men are built when they have spent their entire adult lives doing real work with their bodies. His hands were the kind that came from shaping raw leather into finished saddles, from splitting fence rails and hauling timber, and doing every physical thing that keeping a mountain ranch alive required. His jaw was strong, and his eyes, when they caught the light, were the color of good whiskey held up to a window. He was by any honest accounting a man in the prime of his life, but the lines carved around his eyes belonged to someone 20 years older, and his gaze carried the flat, distant quality of a man who had checked out of the present moment a long time ago, who had gone somewhere cold and interior where the living could not easily follow. The people of Stone Creek had been watching him disappear for 3 years. Doc Eleanor Marsh, who had practiced medicine in the valley for 15 years and who did not soften her words when softening them helped nobody, had taken Silas's younger brother Clem aside after church 3 Sundays past and said what she had been building toward for months. She said she was worried about Silas, not the worried of a friend concerned for a neighbor, the worried of a physician who was running calculations in her head about timelines and outcomes and not liking the number she was getting. Clem Harrow was 27, the middle of the 3 brothers, and the most sociable man in a 20-mile radius by a margin so large it barely warranted comparison. Where Silas was a fortress, Clem was a front porch. He ran the Stone Creek Mercantile, a warm and cluttered establishment packed with everything frontier life required, and he greeted every person who walked through his door with the natural warmth of someone for whom caring about other people required no effort at all. For 3 years, the whole of Clem's attention had narrowed to a single purpose. He was trying to save his brother. He had invited Silas to holiday dinners. Silas came, ate in silence, and left before the coffee was poured. He had arranged through careful social maneuvering encounters with women at church functions who were looking for a good man. Silas refused to attend church functions. He had suggested they visit Hannah's grave together as brothers, so that the grief would not have to be carried alone. Silas had looked at him with a voice so cold it could freeze running water and told him to mind his own business. He had tried patience and anger and humor and directness, and none of it had moved the needle by a single degree. And now Silas's shirts were hanging off his shoulders. His belt had been cinched 2 notches tighter than it had been at the start of autumn. Doc Marsh had used the word timeline in their conversation outside the church, and the way she said it had stayed with Clem like a splinter he could not work free. He was watching his brother die. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way a man on the frontier dies when he has decided that living is no longer worth the effort. Quietly, stubbornly, one cold meal at a time, one sleepless night at a time, one morning after another in that leather shop, where the work was the only thing keeping the darkness from closing in completely. This was the context. This was the arithmetic that led Clem Harrow on a rainy Thursday in July of 1877 to sit down at the desk in the back room of his mercantile and do something that was either the most loving or the most misguided thing he had ever done in his 27 years on Earth. He answered a mail-order bride advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper. He used Silas's name. He used Silas's address. And most crucially, he wrote the letters in the voice of the man Silas Harrow had been before the winter of 1875 took everything from him. He wrote letters full of hunger and hope and the particular longing of a man who still believed the future held something worth wanting. He wrote about the mountains, about the way the first light of dawn struck the bighorn peaks as though God had tipped a bucket of gold across the stone. He wrote about the sound of the creek in early spring when the snowmelt turned it from a whisper into a roar that you could hear from 3 miles away. He wrote about loneliness that went down past the bone and into something deeper than bone. He wrote about wanting to build a life with someone who was not afraid of hard country or hard work. He wrote everything except the truth. He did not write about Hannah. He did not write about faith. He did not write about the grave on the ridge or the name carved above the fireplace or the man who had not smiled in over 1,000 days. Someone answered. The youngest Harrow brother knew nothing about any of this, and if he had known, he would have had opinions. Reed Harrow was 24 years old, the wild one of the three, a tracker and hunter of genuine skill, who spent more time in the high country than at the ranch and who communicated better with animals than with most human beings. He had a dry and sparse wit that he used the way a man uses a knife he keeps sharp. He deployed it carefully when something needed cutting and sheathed it the rest of the time. He had been 21 when Hannah died, old enough to understand what had been lost, still young enough that the grief had expressed itself in him not as silence the way it had settled into Silas, but as a low and constant anger at the fundamental unfairness of a universe that could take a woman that good, that young, in that way. That anger had never fully cooled. It lived in his chest like banked coals, and it was ready to flare at the slightest disturbance of the careful balance the three brothers had built around their shared wound. Reed rode into Stone Creek on a cold morning in January, descending from 3 days in the high country with a string of rabbits across his saddle and the particular wariness of a man who has been alone in the wilderness long enough that returning to civilization requires a period of careful readjustment. He stabled his horse, checked the ranch's upper fence line, and went back to the stone-quiet business of living in a house that had learned to hold its grief the way good leather holds its shape without showing the stress points until you pressed on them. He did not know that everything was about to change. Winifred Ashford had been 23 years old when she boarded the eastbound stage in Philadelphia with a carpetbag, 3 traveling trunks, and a green parrot in a wooden cage. She went by Winnie. She had gone by Winnie since she was 4 years old, when her father, a school teacher named William Ashford, had decided that Winifred was too formal a name for a child who laughed the way she laughed and fell down the way she fell down. Her father had been dead for 6 years. Her mother had followed him 2 years after that. At 17, Winnie Ashford had found herself alone in the world with a modest education, a talent for patience, and the immediate necessity of earning her own living. She had been a governess for 5 years employed by the Weston family of Philadelphia. The Westons were wealthy in the way that certain Philadelphia families are wealthy with old money and maintained appearances and the specific social confidence of people who have never had to question whether the world would accommodate them. Bernard Weston was in his middle 40s, silver at the temples, impeccably presented, and possessed of the smooth social ease of a man who had spent his entire life being obeyed. For 4 years, the arrangement had worked. Winnie had taught the Weston children with the genuine enthusiasm of a woman who found something like joy in the work of helping young minds make sense of the world. She was good at it. She had her father's patience and her mother's warmth, and the children had responded to her in the way that children respond to adults who actually see them. The trouble had begun in her fifth year when Bernard Weston's attention shifted in a direction Winnie had not been prepared for and did not want. She had refused him, clearly directly without leaving room for misinterpretation. His response had been methodical and complete. Within 6 weeks of her refusal, she was dismissed without a reference letter. And the mechanism of Upper Philadelphia society, which Bernard Weston understood and could operate with the ease of a man who had used it many times before, had closed around her name like a fist. No household in the city would hire her. She had written 43 letters. She had received 43 polite and identical rejections. She had $19 left when she found the advertisement in the newspaper. She found it in the common room of the boarding house where she was living week to week. The newspaper was 3 weeks old and had been left on the table by another resident. She almost did not read it. She had been sitting there for an hour watching the rain come down outside the window and doing the arithmetic of her situation in her head, arriving at the same sum no matter how she arranged the numbers. Then she saw the advertisement, and she read the letters that followed it, letters that had been forwarded through the newspaper's service, and that she had to pay 20 cents to collect letters that described a man and a place and a life in language so specific and so full of genuine longing that she read them 3 times before she trusted what she was reading. The letters talked about mountains, about mornings so cold and so beautiful they made a man feel small in the best possible way, about a house built with careful hands for a life the writer had not yet been able to fill, about loneliness as a physical thing, a weight carried in the chest, and about the tentative hope that the right person might make that weight something other than a burden, about not being afraid of hard work or hard country or starting over. She memorized passages, whole paragraphs held in her mind like provisions stored against a hard winter. She had $19. She had no prospects. She had a parrot named Penelope, who had over the course of 5 years absorbed the vocabulary of the sailors who worked the docks near the Weston family's shipping warehouse. Winnie had been working on correcting Penelope's language for the better part of 3 years, with results that could generously be described as incomplete. Penelope was the only thing left in her life that was entirely and unequivocally hers. She could not leave the bird behind. She answered the advertisement. Before she packed a single trunk, before she bought a single ticket, she pressed something small and flat inside the lining of her traveling coat. A velvet pouch, soft and dark red, the size of a playing card folded once. She pressed it against her body every morning when she dressed, and she checked for it throughout the day, with the reflexive certainty of a soldier checking for a sidearm in uncertain territory. She had been doing this for 6 years, since the day after her father's funeral when she had found the letter in the cedar box he kept on his desk. She had never opened the pouch in front of another living soul. When people noticed the gesture and asked about it, which happened occasionally because the gesture was visible enough to draw attention, her face went white with a speed that stopped the question before it finished forming. She changed the subject and moved on, and the people around her learned not to press. Whatever the velvet pouch contained, it was not something she was ready to share. It was not something she had been ready to share in 6 years. It traveled with her the way certain griefs travel, present in every room, never mentioned, defining the shape of everything around it by its untouchable presence. She spent 6 weeks on the road, stage lines and transfer stations, and the particular exhausted endurance of a woman who had committed to a direction and was not going to waver from it now. She arrived in Stone Creek, Wyoming territory on a Tuesday morning in the deep of winter, wearing a traveling dress in pale blue wool that would have been perfectly adequate for a brisk walk along the Schuylkill River, and that was in the context of a Wyoming February morning, with the temperature sitting 12 degrees above zero, and the wind doing what Wyoming wind does, something close to suicidal. Her coat was fashionable and thin. Her boots had been designed for cobblestones. The hat on her head was decorated with fabric flowers that had somewhere around Cheyenne frozen into stiff and mournful shapes like a small garden that had been ambushed by the truth about November. She was shivering so violently that the tremor was visible from across the street. Sheriff Harlan Holt had been waiting at the stage stop. He was 53 years old, a man built by decades of frontier law enforcement into something compact and certain, and he had an expression on his face that suggested he had just witnessed something that did not fit neatly into his considerable experience of unusual situations. He had already been to the leather shop to collect Silas Harrow, and Silas was crossing the frozen mud of the main street now, with his jaw set and his amber eyes narrowed to points, walking with the controlled fury of a man who already knew exactly what had happened and was composing what he intended to say to his younger brother. He had known the moment Sheriff Holt said the words mail-order bride who had done it. The recognition had come not as a question, but as a certainty, the way you recognize your own handwriting on an envelope, even when you cannot immediately remember writing the letter. There was only one person in his life with both the means and the motive. Only one person who had been watching him with that particular combination of desperation and love for 3 years, trying every conventional approach available, and who had finally, in apparent desperation, decided to try something unconventional. Clem was going to answer for this. But first Silas looked at the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach. She was young, 22, maybe 23, though the cold had stripped away whatever composure she normally wore and left her looking younger still. A delicate face, heart-shaped with high cheekbones, painted pink by the cold. A small, straight nose. A mouth that even now, even in the middle of obvious misery, had a shape that suggested it was more naturally inclined toward a smile than toward anything else. Her eyes, when she turned toward him, were the blue of a mountain lake in July, that particular clear and deep blue that you only see in high country water on a cloudless day, and they were carrying more hope than any rational person had any business carrying in a Wyoming February. Her hair was honey-colored, and the cold had undone whatever careful arrangement she had started the morning with, so that loose strands hung damp around her temples and her face. She was shivering hard enough that the whole of her slight body was involved in the effort of staying upright. And she was, despite all of it, despite the cold and the obvious exhaustion and the fact that she was clearly moments away from either crying or fainting or both, standing straight. Her chin was lifted just slightly, just enough to be noticed. Just enough to say something about the person underneath the frozen dress and the inadequate coat. Silas noticed it the way a craftsman notices quality in raw material. That small lift of the chin was not performance. It was instinct. It was the physical expression of someone whose deeper nature refused to collapse, even when collapsing would have been the rational choice. He was going to have to tell her there had been a mistake. He was going to have to tell this woman who had crossed 2,000 miles of winter country on the strength of letters his brother had written in his name that none of it was real. He walked toward her. She turned to face him fully. He saw her draw a breath. He saw her attempt to stand straighter, though she was already standing as straight as the cold allowed. He saw her try to gather herself into the presentation of a woman meeting the man she had traveled across the country to marry. "Are you Mr. Silas Harrow?" she asked. Her voice shook, cold and nerves together, shaking the words as they came out. But they came out clearly, properly formed, educated. The accent was unmistakably Eastern. She attempted a step toward him. What happened next happened in the time between one heartbeat and the next. Her skirts had been stiffening in the cold since in Cheyenne, the thick wool growing rigid around her legs, like material that had forgotten its original purpose. The sole of her left boot, thin and built for city walking, caught on the stiffened hem of her dress. Her center of gravity made a decision that her balance had no authority over. And Winifred Ashford, with the comprehensive and total commitment of a disaster that has decided to see itself through, pitched forward and fell directly into the water trough that sat in front of Ruth Langley's general store. The impact was complete. She hit the ice-filmed surface of the trough with a sound that startled the stagecoach horses into a simultaneous sideways lunge, both animals throwing their heads and dancing against their traces, while the driver swore and hauled at the reins. The birdcage at her feet toppled sideways with a crash. The cloth cover that had kept Penelope calm through 6 weeks of travel flew off in one clean piece and revealed the parrot in her full and unfiltered glory. Penelope had been confined in a rocking cage for 40 days. She had been cold since Utah. She had been jolted and jounced and subjected to the company of strangers in the absence of her person, in the indignity of travel at its most fundamental and unglamorous. What Penelope said to the assembled citizens of Stone Creek, Wyoming territory in the next several seconds was comprehensive, fluent, anatomically specific, and delivered at a volume that carried to every building on the street. 2 miners who had been emerging from the saloon stopped in the doorway with their mouths open. A woman crossing the far end of the street with a basket of eggs stopped walking and stood still. The minister's wife, who had been sweeping the chapel steps, looked up and clutched the fabric at her collar. One of Winnie's trunks, jolted loose from its stack by the collision, popped its latch and contributed a cascade of ladies' underthings to the scene. A pair of lace-trimmed drawers caught on the iron post of the hitching rail and hung there in the icy breeze with the quiet resignation of a surrender flag run up by a very small and very refined army. A passing dog seized Winnie's frozen flower hat and trotted away with it. Winnie lay across the ice trough. Her skirts were hiked up. Her hair had completed its escape from every pin that had been restraining it. Her face was the color of a fresh barn door, and it had nothing to do with the cold. She was the picture of absolute and total and irretrievable mortification. Silas stopped. Sheriff Holt stopped. Ruth Langley, who had pressed her face against the window of her store at the sound of the commotion, stopped. The two miners stopped. The woman with the egg basket stopped. Penelope had not stopped. For one long and perfectly frozen moment, the entire visible population of Stone Creek held its collective breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The horses stamped and snorted steam. The dog turned a corner with the hat and was gone. And then something happened in Silas Harrow's chest. It started as a pressure, an unfamiliar sensation located somewhere deep behind his sternum, like a muscle being asked to perform a movement it had not been asked to perform in a very long time. The pressure built and moved upward through his throat, gaining momentum with the inevitability of something that had been held back too long. He felt it coming and could not have stopped it any more than he could have stopped the wind. A sound burst from his mouth that he did not recognize as his own. It was a laugh, not a polite social sound, not a careful, contained exhale that could pass for amusement at a distance. A full and genuine and entirely involuntary laugh that erupted from somewhere below his ribs and moved through him like a wave through deep water, shaking his massive shoulders and creasing his weathered face, and transforming his features so completely that Ruth Langley, watching from behind her window, gripped the sill with both hands and said something under her breath that she would not repeat later. Silas Harrow was laughing. For the first time in 1,014 days, Silas Harrow was laughing. Sheriff Holt's jaw dropped open and stayed there. Clem, who had been galloping up the road from town and who had arrived just in time to see the entire sequence of events unfold, froze with one foot in the stirrup and one boot in the air, his face cycling through approximately 15 separate expressions in the space of 4 seconds. The most prominent of these expressions were guilt and horror, and a wild and desperate hope that had no business existing in a situation like this one, and yet existed anyway. The laugh died. It always dies. The familiar weight settled back onto Silas's features like a coat he had been wearing so long, he no longer noticed it going back on. But his face felt strange, stretched, as though something had cracked in it that was not going to sit quite the same way it had sat before. He stepped forward, he reached down, he offered his hand. Winnie grasped it with fingers so cold that even through his calloused palm, he could feel the burning cold of them, the way extreme cold burns like fire when it has gone deep enough. He pulled her upright with no particular effort. Standing, she reached his shoulder. Barely. She was small-boned and slight in a way that made his hands look like they had been made for an entirely different scale of existence. Up close, he could see that her blue eyes were starting to fill. The hope that had been in them was curdling around the edges as the weight of his expression and his silence in the particular way he was looking at her began to convey what she had not yet been told in words. "Miss," Silas said, and his rough voice worked to be as gentle as a rough voice can manage, which is not especially gentle. "There has been a mistake. A serious one. I did not send for a mail-order bride. I believe my brother Clem may have arranged this without my knowledge or my consent. I am very sorry you have come all this way." The words landed. The tears came quietly tracking down her frozen cheeks and catching the pale winter light. She pulled her hand from his and wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture so automatic and so solitary that something moved in Silas's chest that he immediately identified and immediately refused to acknowledge. "I see," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. The letters were so kind, so thoughtful. I suppose I was foolish to believe that someone actually wanted me. Those 4 words fell on Silas Harrow like something he had not braced for. Someone actually wanted me. He set his jaw. He offered to pay for her return journey to Philadelphia. She shook her head. She told her story the way people tell stories they have rehearsed often enough that the sharpest edges have worn smooth. 5 years with the Weston family. Bernard Weston. The refusal and its consequences. Dismissed without a reference, blacklisted, 43 rejection letters, $19. No family, no options. And a parrot Reiko, she added, and her voice mixed apology and exhaustion in equal parts, who is usually much better behaved. The cold agitates her. As though to confirm this assessment, Penelope chose this precise moment to add something to the proceedings that made the minister's wife grip her collars again and made one of the miners turn to the other with an expression of genuine admiration for the range of what he had just heard. "I am working on correcting it," Winnie said. Silas looked at the parrot. He looked at the woman. A moment passed. "I can see you are making excellent progress," he said. It was not much, a dry observation, the driest possible version of something that might in different circumstances have counted as humor. But the corner of Winnie's mouth moved, not quite a smile, the ghost of the idea of one. The suggestion that somewhere inside her a smile existed and was considering whether the situation warranted it. Silas noticed this and felt briefly unsettled by the fact that he had, without deciding to try to make her feel better. He had not done that for anyone in 3 years. The practical problem was immediate. Winnie could not remain outside. Doc Marsh arrived at the edge of the gathering, having heard the commotion from her office 2 buildings down, and looked at Winnie with the professional assessment of a woman who had been calculating frostbite onset times for 15 years. She said what needed to be said in the direct way she said everything this woman needed to be indoors, warm and fed within the hour, or they would be having a different kind of conversation entirely. The boarding house was full with railroad surveyors. Clem's Mercantile had no living quarters. The practical options were limited. Sheriff Holt said the name of the Harrow Ranch as though he were testing the weight of a word he already knew would land wrong. "Absolutely not," Silas said immediately. 3 unmarried men and a young woman under the same roof was not a situation he was willing to create. Not appropriate, not acceptable. "More appropriate than her freezing to death on Main Street?" Holt asked. Doc Marsh settled it the way she settled most things. She said she would check on the woman daily. She said propriety was a luxury available to people who were not at immediate medical risk. She said that anyone with a specific objection to the arrangement was welcome to raise it with her directly. She fixed the assembled crowd of Stone Creek with a look that made it extremely clear what that conversation would cost and how long it would last and who would win it. Nobody in Stone Creek argued with Doc Eleanor Marsh twice. Silas heard himself agree. The words came out of his mouth before the deliberating part of him had finished deliberating. "She can stay in the spare room, temporarily, until the cold breaks and a proper arrangement can be made." Winnie looked up at him with her blue eyes full of gratitude and something more fragile than gratitude, the expression of a person who has been handed a foothold on a ledge they were not certain existed. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow," she said. "I promise I will not be any trouble at all." Even as she said it, she stepped backward and walked directly into the fallen bird cage. The cage skidded across the ice. The cover flew free completely. Penelope, who had been watching the entire situation with the focused black eyes of an animal that has been waiting for her moment, opened her beak and delivered a final comprehensive address to the citizens of Stone Creek that produced from the child who had materialized at the edge of the crowd an expression of transcendent educational delight. Winnie scooped up the cage. She apologized to the bird, to Silas, to the minister's wife, to the child's mortified mother, and to the general population of Wyoming Territory. Silas closed his eyes. He drew one slow breath through his nose. He gathered all 3 of Winnie's trunks and lifted them the way a man lifts things he has been lifting without particular notice since the age of 12. He started walking toward the edge of town. "My house is this way," he said without turning around. "Can you manage the bird?" She followed him. Her frozen skirts negotiated each step as a separate event. She slipped on the ice twice in the first 50 yards. The first time she caught herself on a fence post. The second time she caught herself on the nose of a horse tied to a hitching rail, and the horse gave her a look of deeply personal offense. Behind them, Harlan Holt shook his head, and said to Ruth Langley, who had come outside to watch the procession moving up the road toward the mountain, "That is either going to be the best thing that ever happened to that man or the worst." Ruth, who was already reaching for the calendar she kept behind her counter, who was already thinking about which number she would begin with, again replied without hesitation, "He laughed, Harlan. He actually laughed." She paused. "I will take those odds any day of the week." The ranch house was cold when they arrived. Harrow's Ridge sat on a natural shelf higher up the mountain than any other homestead in the valley, a sprawling property of 400 acres, where the three brothers raised cattle and horses, and where Silas, in the leather shop he had built beside the main house, crafted saddles and bridle work, whose reputation had traveled to ranches across 3 territories. The main house was 2 stories of carefully notched and fitted logs built by Silas's own hands over the course of a summer and a half, built with the attention to detail of a man who was building something intended to last longer than he would. Carved railings on the porch and the staircase, built-in shelves in the main room, window seats positioned to catch the best angle of morning light, a kitchen designed at a height meant for a woman's reach, not a man's. Every choice in the place was the choice of someone who had been building it for a specific life with a specific person and had wanted it to be perfect. Silas kicked the front door open and set the trunks in the entryway. The cold poured in with them. Winnie followed him inside. She set Penelope's cage on a small table near the window, and then she stopped moving entirely. She stood in the middle of the main room, and her eyes traveled across the space with a quality of attention that surprised him. She was seeing things he had stopped being able to see. She was seeing what the house had been built to be. The carved mantelpiece, the wide planked floors sanded to a smoothness that remembered bare feet, the window seats in the positions he had built them, though the cushions were faded now and losing their shape. The curtains still hanging, but sun-washed and dusty, the colors drained out of them. The dried flowers on the shelf above the bookcase, petals brittle and brown and holding their form through some principle of determined structure rather than any remaining vitality. The sign above the kitchen doorway, painted in a hand that was not his, in careful script, that still held its shape after 3 years without the person who had made it. "Where love lives." Her eyes moved to the fireplace, to the beam above it, to the name carved there in letters so precisely formed they could have been cut with the fine tools he used for his best leatherwork, each character a deliberate act of will performed by hands that had been shaking. Hannah. Winnie looked at the name. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She did not ask about it. Something passed across her face that Silas, watching her from the doorway, found he could not immediately categorize. It was not jealousy. It was not discomfort. It was quieter than either of those things, and it was the expression of a person who understood from experience what it meant to carry something you could not put down, something that shaped the space around it by its immovable presence. She looked at the name the way you look at something that belongs to someone else's grief and must be approached with care. Then she turned to face him and simply waited. Silas built the fire. He set water to boil for tea. He moved through the domestic motions of the thing with the efficiency of long habit and the sounds of it. The scratch of the flint, the crackle of new wood catching the kettle beginning its slow preparation felt strange in a way he could not have explained precisely. They were sounds a house makes when it is in the business of being lived in. This house had not been making those sounds in a long time going. He told her where the blankets were. He told her which room was the spare room. He told her to get out of her wet clothes and into something dry and warm, and they could talk once she was no longer in immediate danger of losing her fingers. She went upstairs. He stood alone in his kitchen and listened to the water come to a boil and tried to identify the sensation sitting in his chest. He could not name it. He had not needed to name sensations like this one for a long time, and the vocabulary for it was rusty with disuse. 20 minutes later, she came back downstairs wrapped in every quilt she had found, her honey-colored hair loose and drying around her shoulders, her face showing the evidence of tears shed privately in the spare room. She sat by the fire. He gave her tea. She held the cup with both hands and did not speak for a moment, and neither did he. "The letters I received," she said finally, not quite looking at him, "were very detailed. They talked about the mountains, about the way mornings feel here early before the light fully arrives, about wanting someone to not be alone anymore. I memorized passages." "My brother wrote those letters." "Yes." She looked at him, then, and her eyes were sharp in a way he had not expected. But he wrote them about you, about who he believed you still were. The fire moved. Outside, the wind found the gap between the logs it always found when the temperature dropped this far, and it made the low moan it always made through that gap. And Silas sat with a woman he did not know in a house built for a life he no longer had, and he said nothing because he did not know what to say to that. He told her, eventually staring at the fire rather than at her, because some things are easier to say to flames than to a living face. He told her about Hannah. He told her about 1875. He told her about the blizzard and the night that would not end, and the baby who had arrived wrong feet first and who had lived for 4 hours. Long enough for Hannah to hold her. Long enough to give her a name. He told her the name. Faith. He had not said that name out loud to another person in over a year. That is a beautiful name, Winnie said. That was all she said. Not that she was sorry, though she was. Not that it would be all right, because it would not entirely, not ever. She said the name was beautiful, and she looked at the fire, and she let the silence hold the weight of the rest of it, because some things cannot be carried by words, and some people understand that. And Winnie Ashford, sitting in a stranger's house in the mountains of Wyoming, wrapped in every quilt she had found, understood it. The evening settled around them. The fire burned lower and steadier. The wind worked at the house, and the house held. Silas explained the practical situation: she would stay temporarily, until the cold broke enough for travel, until something more suitable could be arranged. He was not promising anything beyond shelter and time. She said she understood. She said she was grateful. She said, with a self-deprecating honesty that came naturally to a person who had tripped over her own traveling dress in front of a town full of strangers, that she was sorry for the chaos of her arrival. I assure you, she said, that falling into water troughs is not a regular habit of mine. Falling over other things possibly, but not usually troughs. Silas felt something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not yet, but something close to the geography where a smile might be found if a person looked long enough. You admit to being clumsy then, he said. Terribly, she said, and her own mouth curved just slightly. My mother used to say I could trip over my own shadow on a clear day. It was not much. It was the smallest possible beginning, but it was something neither of them had expected from this evening, and both of them knew it. Reed arrived after dark. He came in from 3 days in the high country, cold and hungry, and in no mood for complications. And he found complications waiting for him in the main room of his own house. His brother explained. Reed listened with the particular quality of stillness that was his version of processing new information, and then his reaction moved through its stages. Disbelief, a cold fury at Clem that would be settled between brothers at a later time, and then a simmering suspicion directed at the stranger who was sitting by his family's fire. He stood at the foot of the staircase and looked at Winnie, who had come to the top of the stairs at the sound of voices, wrapped in her quilts, her hair loose around her shoulders. Reed was 6 feet and 2 inches of coiled, watchful, outdoor, hardened energy, and he looked at her with the assessing, green hazel eyes of a man who had spent his life reading terrain for signs of danger. How long are you staying? He asked. There was no warmth in the question. It was a request for operational information. Winnie met his eyes. She did not look away. She did not step back from the top of the staircase. She did not perform any of the small social retreats that a person less steady might have managed in the face of that kind of watchful hostility. Only until I can find woe and afford my own lodging, she said. I have no intention of imposing on anyone. The act of holding his gaze, of not looking away, registered in the room like a sound no one had anticipated. Reed grunted. He went upstairs. His bedroom door closed, not slammed. Just closed the way a man closes a door when he has decided not to slam it, because slamming would communicate something he does not want to admit to communicating. Penelope, from her cage on the small table by the window, broke the silence that followed with the impeccable dramatic instinct she had been deploying for years. Abandoned ship, she announced. Clem, who had followed Silas back to the ranch at a cautious distance, let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Nobody spoke, but the tension cracked just enough to let the air back into the room. That first night at Harrow's Ridge was 4 people and 1 parrot distributed across a house that had been built for more and had been holding less for 3 years. Each of them in their own room, each of them awake longer than they had intended to be. Sometime past midnight, the house was still and cold and dark. The fire in the main room had burned down to coals. Silas was in his room with his eyes open, listening to the wind. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Soft ones, careful ones. He had built this house. He knew every sound it made in every kind of weather. He knew which board on the third step had a slight give in it. He knew the sound of the kitchen door when it settled in cold air. He had been sleeping alone in this house for 3 years, and his awareness of its sounds had become as automatic as breathing. He rose. He went to the doorway of his room. He looked down into the darkness of the main floor. Winnie was standing in the center of the room. She had come down, he understood, to check on Penelope, whose cage was near the window where the cold would be strongest. She had unwrapped one of her own quilts and was draping it around the cage, tucking the edges carefully, the way you tuck blankets around something you want to keep warm. When she finished, she straightened. Her eyes found the fireplace, found the beam above it, found the name there visible, even in the faint orange light of the dying coals. Hannah. Winnie reached up. She was not tall enough to touch the beam itself, but she could reach toward it, and she did. Her hand extended toward the name, not quite touching the wood hovering there, in the way that hands hover when they are reaching towards something that requires a kind of permission you are not certain you have. Then she lowered her hand and placed it flat on the mantelpiece itself. And she spoke in a voice so quiet that Silas, standing motionless in the dark of the second-floor hallway, almost could not make out the words. "I am sorry," she said. "I am sorry he lost you. I am sorry you did not get to watch your daughter grow up." A pause. The coals shifted. The wind moved against the house. "I promise I will not try to take your place. I just need somewhere safe for a little while." Silas stood in the dark and did not move. He had come downstairs because he heard movement, because 3 years of living alone in a house he had built had made him attuned to its every breath and settling and sound. He had come to see what had woken him. He had not expected this. He stood in the dark of the upper hallway and watched this woman from Boston, who had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of letters she believed were real, who had fallen into a water trough in front of a town full of strangers and made him laugh for the first time in over 1,000 days, who had a parrot that had scandalized a minister's wife, who had a spine apparently made of materials that did not easily yield, who was now standing in his kitchen at midnight, speaking to his dead wife's name, with tenderness, with the care of someone who understood that the dead deserve to be spoken to as though they can hear. Silas retreated to his room without a sound. He lay on his back in the dark and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes until colors moved behind his lids. He lay there for a long time, listening to the wind, trying to understand what was happening in his chest. Because something was. Something small and unfamiliar and genuinely frightening. Something pushing upward through 3 years of compacted grief, the way the first green shoot of spring pushes up through the last frozen crust of late-season snow, insistent and quiet and not asking permission. He did not know what it was yet. Across the valley, Ruth Langley slept without knowing that she would be resetting her calendar in the morning. Downstairs, a woman from Boston who had nowhere else to go sat for a moment longer in the firelight before going quietly back up to the spare room, carrying the faint warmth of a house that was beginning very slowly and very reluctantly to remember what it was built for. And in the dark between them, in the silence of a house that had held only grief for 3 years, something had started that neither of them had asked for, and neither of them was ready for, and neither of them, it would turn out, was going to be able to stop. The cold held for 3 weeks after Winifred Ashford's arrival, piling snow against the single road out of the valley until it lay under drifts taller than a man on horseback. The nearest town with reliable eastbound stage service was 3 hard days south under good conditions, and the conditions were not good. They were, in fact, the conditions Wyoming produces between November and April as a matter of routine, and that the territory has never particularly apologized for. Winnie was stranded at Harrow's Ridge. Whether anyone at that ranch found this desirable was a question with an answer that varied by the hour. They established a routine, the way people establish routines when circumstances force proximity, and politeness is the only alternative to open warfare. Silas rose before the light and disappeared into his leather shop, which sat beside the main house, connected by a covered walkway he had built so that weather would not interrupt the work. He emerged when hunger or physical necessity required it, and not before. Clem rode down to the Mercantile in Stone Creek each morning and returned each evening with supplies and an expression of guilty hopefulness that made Silas's hands close into fists involuntarily every time he saw it coming up the road. Reed tracked into the high country for days at a stretch, moving through the mountain territory he knew better than any map could represent, checking trap lines and reading the signs of the land with the focused attention that was his particular form of meditation. And when he left alone for most of each day, in a house that had forgotten the sound of someone moving through it with purpose, did the only thing she had ever known how to do when the ground shifted beneath her feet. She made herself useful. She started in the kitchen because the kitchen is the heart of a house, and this heart had stopped beating. The surfaces had not been properly cleaned in months. The pantry held enough salt pork and dried beans to survive a siege, but nothing that bore any honest relationship to a balanced meal. The wood stove was temperamental in the particular way of iron stoves that have been operated without consistent care, holding hot spots and cold spots that did not correspond to any logical system, and that had to be learned through experience. Her first 3 attempts at biscuits resulted in objects so thoroughly carbonized that Penelope, who had eaten hardtack on a moving stagecoach for 40 days without complaint, turned her head away from the offered piece and fixed Winnie with the specific look of a creature that has standards. Winnie did not stop. She adjusted the position of the dampers. She mapped the stove's unpredictable hot zones with small experimental batches. She revised her timing by increments, learning the stove through patience and attention and the willingness to try again after each failure without deciding the situation was hopeless. On the 4th morning, as she produced a batch of biscuits that were golden across the top and soft through the center, and that filled the kitchen with a smell that had not existed inside those log walls since Hannah Harrow drew her last breath. Winnie set them on the table at noon, a clean plate, butter in a dish, honey in a small jar with a spoon laid alongside it, a cup of coffee still hot positioned at the head of the table where a man of this house would naturally sit. Then she went upstairs to mend a curtain that had been drooping from its rod since she arrived, and she waited. Silas came in from the workshop at his usual time. He crossed the covered walkway and pushed into the kitchen, intending to eat cold salt pork, was standing at the counter and be back at his bench within 5 minutes. It was what he had done every day at this hour for 3 years. It was what his body had learned to do, because the alternative was sitting down at a table set for a person who was no longer there to sit across from him. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. The biscuits sat on the plate, still faintly steaming. The butter was soft from being placed near the stove in advance. The coffee was the right temperature. The honey jar had a spoon. Someone had thought about what he might want before he knew he wanted it. He stood in that doorway for 10 full seconds. No one was there to see his face, which was probably for the best, because the expression it was making was not one he would have chosen for an audience. It was the expression of a man who has been struck in a place he had forgotten existed, a place sealed off so thoroughly for so long that the existence of it had ceased to feel like something worth protecting. 3 years of cold meals eaten standing up over a counter. 3 years of coffee made in the dark and consumed without tasting it, because taste is a form of presence, and he had not been fully present for 3 years. 3 years of treating food as fuel and nothing more. And here were biscuits. He ate 3 of them. He said nothing. He returned to his workshop without a word of acknowledgement. But from that day forward, Silas Harrow came to the kitchen at noon without fail. It was the first routine he changed in 3 years. Neither of them mentioned it. Winnie expanded her work outward from the kitchen with the steady, patient energy of a woman who understood that transforming a neglected space requires consistency rather than grand gestures. She washed the curtains and rehung them. She cleared the dead flowers from the vase on the mantelpiece and replaced them with pine boughs cut from the nearest tree line, the sharp, clean scent of them cutting through the years of accumulated dust and leather oil and the particular staleness of rooms where windows have not been opened in a long time. She swept floors that had not been properly swept since autumn. She beat rugs out on the porch rail, leaving them in the cold air to breathe. She mended clothes from a basket she found in the corner of the sitting room, darning socks with the small, precise stitches of someone who had been trained in domestic arts as a professional skill. She polished the window glass until the winter light came through, clear and strong, and the rooms that had been dim for years were suddenly full of the kind of light that shows you what a space was meant to be. She did not touch Hannah's things. She did not move the sign above the kitchen doorway, its letters still clear in their painted script. She did not ask about the name on the beam above the fireplace. She worked around the grief the way a river works around a large stone, acknowledging its presence in the path by the care with which she chose her route, never pretending it was not there. Slowly, over the course of days, the house began to change. Not in its structure, in something harder to name than structure. It changed in its breath, in the quality of the air inside it, in the difference between a space where someone is waiting to die and a space where someone is choosing to live. When the cold eased enough for travel down to Stone Creek, Winnie walked the 3 miles to town in the new winter clothes that Silas had purchased for her at Ruth Langley's store without ceremony or discussion. He had called it practicality. She had thanked him. He had walked away. She had noticed that his ears turned red when he was thanked for something, and she filed that observation away without comment. The way you file away knowledge about difficult terrain against the day when it might matter. Ruth Langley hired her within 10 minutes of their first real conversation. Ruth needed help with inventory and customer service, particularly as the winter wore on, and the railroad surveyors who had been occupying the boarding house began moving through, requiring the particular logistical attention that groups of traveling men in a small store require. The pay was honest and modest, and Winnie accepted it with the simple gratitude of a person who has learned to distinguish between what she needs and what she might prefer. Agnes Porter, who kept the Stone Creek School with the organized efficiency of a woman who had been educating frontier children for 12 years, listened to Winnie's educational background and offered 3 afternoons a week of shared teaching before the conversation was fully finished. Winnie had work, real work. For the first time since Philadelphia, she had a foothold. Her clumsiness, however, was not something that employment cured. On her first full day in the general store, she turned too quickly in a narrow aisle, and her elbow caught the lower shelf of a carefully constructed pyramid of canned goods. The pyramid was not structurally prepared for this event. 14 cans of peaches, beans, tomatoes, and condensed milk distributed themselves across the store floor with the cheerful randomness of objects set suddenly free, rolling under shelves and behind counters and out through the open front door onto the street, where a passing mule stepped on the condensed milk can with enough force to create a small explosion of sweetened dairy product that startled the mule sideways into a water barrel. Ruth Langley stood behind her counter and watched the entire chain of events unfold with the unruffled calm of a woman who had seen worse and survived it. At the schoolhouse, Winnie slipped on the front steps on her second afternoon and descended 3 feet of ice on the flat of her back in full view of 16 children who responded with the uninhibited and entirely honest delight that children produce when an adult falls down in a sufficiently spectacular manner. She sat up, brushed the snow from her coat, and looked at the 16 small faces arranged in an arc of pure joy. And she laughed, because what else was there to do? Clem had to be physically extracted from behind a flour barrel after watching her get her skirt caught in the mercantile door on a Tuesday afternoon because he was laughing too hard to be useful. But the town of Stone Creek noticed something about Winifred Ashford that outweighed the clumsiness by a margin that grew larger with every week. She was kind, not strategically kind, not kind in the calculated way of a person who is building alliances, kind in the automatic, unconsidered, apparently inescapable way of someone for whom caring about the people around her was not a decision she made, but a condition of her existence. She remembered every name from the first introduction. She asked about children and livestock and the small specific worries that make up the actual texture of a person's daily life. She helped an elderly widow carry her packages without being asked and without making an event of it. She read to the school children with a total physical commitment to each character's voice that had even the most restless boys sitting motionless with their mouths slightly open. Stone Creek warmed to her. Not all at once, because Stone Creek was a frontier town and frontier towns do not warm to newcomers all at once. But steadily, the way a room warms when someone has finally built the fire properly and the wood is caught and the heat is distributing itself toward the walls. Clem and Winnie became friends in the natural, easy way of people who share the same fundamental orientation toward humor as a method of surviving difficult circumstances. They talked in the mercantile while she helped him sort shipments and organize inventory, and their conversations ranged from light to serious and back again, with the comfort of two people who had decided to trust each other without requiring a particular reason to do so. He told her stories about Silas. Not as a campaign, or not only as a campaign, though the campaign was undeniably present. He told her because some things need to be said because the person a man used to be deserves a witness beyond the people who watched him become someone else. He told her about the house Silas had built, about how he had spent 3 summers on it before he proposed to Hannah, building a thing worthy of what he intended to put inside it. He told her about how Silas had designed the kitchen at Hannah's height without being asked, measuring the counters against her reach when she was not looking. He told her about the way Silas used to laugh and what that laugh had sounded like, and how the whole room shifted when it happened. "He is still in there," Clem said one afternoon, not looking at her stacking cans with the focused attention of a man addressing himself to a task, because the alternative is sitting with the full weight of what he is saying. "I see it sometimes, just for a second, and then it closes again like a door shutting." When he set down the bolt of cloth she had been measuring, she thought about what she had seen that morning. The way Silas had paused in the doorway of the main room after breakfast, looking at nothing in particular, his hand resting on the carved railing she had cleaned and polished 2 weeks ago. The way something had moved behind his eyes before he went back to wherever he went when he disappeared inside himself. "He came to lunch again today," she said. Clem looked at her. "That is the 14th day in a row," she said. Clem said nothing, but something shifted in his expression, a careful private relief that he was trying very hard not to wear on the outside where it might be noticed and misread. The change in Reed came without announcement and without the gradual preparation that might have made it comprehensible. He had been gone for 3 days in the high country when he returned on a gray afternoon, unsaddling his horse in the barn with the methodical efficiency of a man who treats the care of his animal as the first priority above all others before food or rest or any human need of his own. He had raised the horse from a colt. The animal's name was Riot, and it had earned that name through a series of incidents that had become something of a legend in the surrounding territory. Riot had bitten 4 ranch hands in the past year. He had kicked through 2 fence posts on separate occasions. He had dragged a wrangler the full length of the corral when the man had made the mistake of approaching him from the wrong angle. He weighed nearly 1,200 pounds and had the temperament of a storm system that had decided to take everything personally. He tolerated exactly one person on the face of the earth, and that person was Reed Harrow, who had understood him from the beginning in the wordless, intuitive way that certain men understand certain horses through some faculty that operates below language. Reed pushed open the barn door. He stopped. Winnie was standing on a wooden stool beside Riot, brushing his mane with long, slow, even strokes. She was talking to the horse in the quiet, steady voice she used when she was not performing for an audience, the voice that was just hers, unhurried and warm. She was telling him about her morning, about the children at the school, and something funny one of them had said. About the biscuits she had slightly burned at breakfast because she had been distracted by Penelope, who had developed a new phrase she was deploying at intervals that morning, and whose timing was as always impeccable in the worst possible way. Riot stood perfectly still. His ears were forward and upright. His eyes were half closed. His enormous dark head was lowered nearly to Winnie's level, which was itself a thing that had never happened with any person other than Reed, and which should not have been happening now with a woman Riot had known for 3 weeks. The horse looked for the first time in his life peaceful. Reed's hand had moved to the knife at his belt by instinct before his conscious mind had fully processed what he was looking at, because what he was looking at did not fit inside the established order of things, and his body had decided this meant danger before his brain had a chance to offer a different interpretation. He stood in the barn doorway for a long moment watching. Then he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, because his voice frequently came out rougher than he intended when something had surprised him. "He does not let anyone touch him." Winnie startled. Her foot shifted on the stool. She grabbed Riot's mane to steady herself, and the horse did not move a single inch. Did not flinch. Did not so much as twitch. "He seemed lonely," Winnie said, looking at Reed directly with the clear blue eyes that Reed had been quietly and irritably acknowledging to himself for 3 weeks, the unsettling quality of appearing to see more than their owner chose to say out loud, like he just wanted someone to talk to him. Something happened in Reed Harrow's face. It was not a softening. He was not a man given to softening, and this moment was not going to change that. It was more like a fracture. A single clean line running through the stone wall he had been maintaining between himself and this woman since the moment of her arrival, and through that fracture, in the fraction of a second before he closed it again, something was visible. something Winnie recognized immediately because she had been living in close proximity to its older, more exhausted version for 3 weeks. Loneliness, the kind that had hardened into anger, because anger is easier to maintain than grief, and anger at least gives a person somewhere to put their energy. The loneliness of a man who had lost someone who mattered and had decided that the safest response was to stop letting anyone matter again. "You are going to fall off that stool and get yourself killed," Reed said. He walked away. He did not close the barn door loudly behind him. The next morning, Winnie found something on the kitchen table. It was a small, carved wooden figure no larger than her closed fist, and it was a hawk. The detail was extraordinary. Each individual feather on the folded wings had been rendered with a precision and patience that spoke of real skill and real time invested. She turned it in the morning light and studied it, and then she asked Clem when he came downstairs whether he knew anything about it. Clem smiled in a way he sometimes smiled when he knew exactly what he was not going to say. 2 days later, there was a horse on the kitchen table. Small and precisely detailed, the muscles of its haunches suggested in the grain of the wood, with the confidence of someone who had spent a great deal of time observing how horses move. Then a rabbit, then a wildflower so finely rendered that she could see the individual petals, each one distinct. Reed never acknowledged the carvings. He never mentioned them. He never looked at them when he passed through the kitchen, or rather, he looked at them in the way a person looks at something they have decided is not there. He left for the mountains and returned, and there would be a new figure on the table, and he would not look at it. Winnie placed each one on the windowsill in her room where the morning light could find them. The hawk first, then the horse beside it, then the rabbit, and the wildflower lined up along the sill in the order they had arrived. She did not thank him for them, and she understood by some instinct she could not have articulated that thanking him would require him to acknowledge them, and that acknowledging them would require him to acknowledge something about himself that he was not yet ready to name. Some distances close in silence, some walls come down through accumulation rather than confrontation, through the patient addition of small things until the structure has changed without anyone having to announce that it changed. The distance between the term Reed had used for her in those first days, the Boston problem, and her actual name was closing, one carved animal at a time. Silas's arc was more complicated and more fiercely defended. He maintained his distance with the discipline of a man who had been practicing emotional isolation, the way other men practice a craft, with regularity and intention, and the specific rigor of someone who understood that the skill once lost would be very difficult to recover. He was polite to Winnie. He was correct. He made sure she had what she needed. He answered direct questions with direct answers. He was not cruel. But the absence of warmth from a man so clearly capable of it was its own particular thing to live alongside. It was the absence of sunlight from a room that you can see through the window is full of light on the other side of the glass. He came home from the workshop one afternoon to find her standing on a chair in the main room, stretching towards something on the high shelf above the bookcase. She was trying to reach a book she had seen up there, a leather-bound volume whose spine had caught her attention, and she was approximately 4 inches shorter than the task required. Silas opened his mouth. Too late. The chair rocked on the uneven floor. Her balance shifted. She made a short, sharp sound and fell backward. He moved. 3 strides across the room, faster than a man his size has any right to move, and his arms closed around her waist as she fell against his chest. The momentum carried them both half a step backward, but he held steady, absorbing the impact without any particular effort, the way a man absorbs impact when the muscles involved have been doing this kind of work since he was 15 years old. For a moment, neither of them moved. Silas could feel the warmth of her body through the layers of wool between them. The pine scent of the boughs she had hung throughout the house was in her hair. She was alive in his arms in a way that made something in his chest contract with a sensation he had not felt in 3 years and did not immediately recognize because he had not expected to feel it again and had not prepared for it. It was different from grief. Grief he knew. He knew its weight and its texture and the specific way it occupied the space behind his ribs. This was different. This was the sensation of a nerve that has been numb for so long that the return of feeling registers as pain, the excruciating and necessary pain of something waking up. Winnie looked up at him. Their faces were separated by a distance that could be measured in inches. Her blue eyes were wide and startled. Her lips were slightly parted. He could see the pulse in her throat beating quickly, and he became aware that his hands were still at her waist and that he had no immediate plan for what to do about that. The air between them changed. It thickened in the way that air changes when the weather is about to shift, when the pressure has been building towards something that cannot be held back much longer. It became something that had nothing to do with gratitude or practical necessity, and everything to do with the fact that he was holding a woman in his arms, and she was looking at him as though she could see something behind his eyes that he had been working very hard to keep hidden. Then Silas set her on her feet and stepped back. Not gradually, all at once, as though the contact had finally registered as something requiring immediate response. "You need to be more careful," he said, and his voice came out harsh in the way that his voice came out harsh when the alternative was saying something true that he was not prepared to say. "You could have seriously hurt yourself." He spent the rest of that afternoon in his leather shop working a piece of saddle skirt with a force that was going to ruin the piece if he did not ease up. He knew it, and he did not ease up because the alternative was sitting still long enough to think about what it had felt like to have Winnie Ashford in his arms, and about the look in her eyes when she had looked up at him, and those were thoughts he had decided he was not going to think. He thought them anyway. That evening he lay on his back in his room and stared at the ceiling in the dark and failed completely to prevent himself from thinking about her. A man keeps his word, even the words he makes only to himself, even the promises that no one else can witness or enforce. Silas Harrow had made certain promises to himself in the months after Hannah died, promises about what he would and would not permit himself to want, and he had been keeping them for 3 years, with the grim consistency of someone who has decided that discipline is the only thing standing between him and something worse. But there are promises that the heart finds ways around. There are walls that the self erects that do not account for the specific woman who will arrive and make them feel like the wrong kind of protection. On a quiet afternoon when all 3 brothers were away from the ranch, Winnie went up to the attic. She had been told that extra blankets were stored there, and the cold had intensified overnight in the way that Wyoming cold intensifies without warning or apology, dropping 10 degrees between evening and dawn and showing no immediate interest in recovery. She found the pull-down attic stairs in the upstairs hallway and climbed them into the low, dusty space under the pine-shake roof, carrying a lamp. She found the blankets quickly. They were folded in a chest near the north wall, cedar-scented and well-preserved. She lifted the lid, took out what she needed, and then she saw the cradle. It was in the corner farthest from the attic entrance, set back against the slanting roof. She almost did not see it. The lamp's light reached it at an angle that made the shadow heavier than the object itself, and for a moment it was just a shape among shapes. Then the light fell across the carved headboard, and she saw what it was, and she moved toward it without quite deciding to move. The wood had been sanded to the smoothness of river stone. She knew the touch of it before she reached it, knew from the texture what it would feel like, because she had spent enough time in this house now to understand the way Silas Harrow's hands related to wood. He sanded to that smoothness. It was his particular standard, the point at which the material had been worked into what he believed it should be. The headboard was carved with wildflowers, each one individual, each petal distinct. The kind of carving that takes hours, that requires a particular quality of attention, the full-bodied, focused attention of a man who is pouring something into the work beyond craft. She understood what those flowers meant. She recognized them. They were the same wildflowers that grew on the ridge behind the ranch, the same ones she had noticed on her first morning through the bedroom window, the purple and gold of them brilliant against the snow-covered hillside. She had asked Clem about them later, what kind they were, and he had told her, and his voice had gone quiet when he told her where the best ones grew up on the ridge, where the light was good in the evening, where Hannah and Faith were buried. Inside the cradle, folded with the care that had survived 3 years of attic darkness, there was a small white blanket and a knitted cap no larger than her 2 hands held together. Winnie set the lamp on the floor and sank to her knees beside the cradle. She pressed her palm flat against the carved wildflowers and held it there. She understood all of it, immediately and completely, with the specific gut-level understanding that arrives sometimes before the mind has finished processing. She understood what this object represented. A man had built this with his hands in the particular joy of someone who is preparing for a child, who is making the world ready for a new person who does not yet exist, but who is coming, who is close, who will be here soon. He had carved wild flowers onto the headboard because he wanted beauty to be the first thing his daughter saw when she opened her eyes. And then he had carried it up that narrow ladder alone and left it here in the dark. Because he could not look at it empty in the nursery where it was supposed to stand, and he could not destroy it, and there was no other place for it to go. Winnie cried without sound. The tears fell freely, but her throat produced nothing because she had learned over a long time that the deepest grief operates below the register of noise, in the place where language has not yet reached and perhaps cannot reach. She cried for Faith, who had lived 4 hours and been held and named, and then was gone. She cried for Hannah, who had carved her name into signs and curtains in the daily life of this house, and then had left it all without being asked. She cried for Silas, who had built this perfect, beautiful thing, and then carried it into the dark by himself. And she cried a little for herself because she understood loss from the inside, because the velvet pouch she carried against her heart every day was its own version of this attic, its own place where something precious was kept, because there was nowhere else it could go. She did not tell Silas she had found the cradle. She could not have found the words for what she might have said. But that evening at supper, the way she looked at him across the table was different, quieter, handled with the specific care of someone who has just been shown something fragile and important and understands that the handling now must be different from what it was before. Something in her manner toward him changed in that way that changes in manners change, not through any single action, but through the accumulation of small adjustments, in the weight of a glance, in the quality of silence, in the distance she chose to stand when she moved through the same room. Silas noticed the change. He could not identify its source. He caught her watching him twice that evening, with an expression that held something much deeper than casual concern, and he looked away first both times, which was new. The external world that had been holding its breath since Winnie's arrival chose this moment to exhale. On an afternoon in late February, with the light beginning to carry the first thin suggestion of approaching spring, a well-dressed man stepped off the afternoon stage from the east onto the frozen mud of Stone Creek's Main Street. He was in his middle 40s, silver at the temples, impeccably groomed in the manner of a man who has never had to choose between appearance and warmth because he has always been able to afford both. He carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who has spent an entire life being obeyed, whose experience of the world is one in which authority runs in a predictable direction, and that direction is toward him. Two men accompanied him. One was lean and quiet and watchful with the economy of movement that marks someone who has made a professional study of being dangerous. The other was larger and rougher, and his eyes had found the saloon before he had fully descended from the stage. The well-dressed man introduced himself to Sheriff Harlan Holt with a measured, reasonable voice. He was looking for a young woman named Winifred Ashford, a former employee who had left his household in Philadelphia in possession of a valuable diamond brooch belonging to his wife. He had a warrant for her arrest issued by a territorial judge in Helena. He produced the document and smoothed its creases on the surface of Holt's desk with manicured fingers, and he looked at Holt with the patient, calm expression of a man who is accustomed to the law working in his favor. His name was Bernard Weston. The news moved through Stone Creek like fire through dry grass. Within hours, the town that had been warming to Winifred Ashford for 3 weeks had divided along a line that nobody had drawn, but that everyone could feel. Bernard Weston was smooth and articulate and bought rounds of drinks at the saloon and told his story with the practiced cadence of a man who had given many presentations to many audiences. His poor wife devastated, his household disrupted. His patience, he said, had been considerable. But there are limits to patience, and he was simply a man seeking the return of what had been taken. Some people believed him. Some people are always inclined to believe the well-dressed man with the official document, because official documents are legible, and the truth is often not. Women who had smiled at Winnie the week before crossed to the far side of the street when they saw her coming. Whispers followed her to the store and the school. The atmosphere of the town, which had been gradually extending toward her like a hand reaching across a table, withdrew. Winnie bore it the way she bore most things that she could not change, which was to say she bore it without allowing it to alter her behavior or her posture or the quality of attention she brought to her work. But Clem, who had spent enough time around her now to read the small signs, saw what it was costing her. He saw how her smile had become something she assembled in the morning before she left the house rather than something that happened on its own. He saw the way her hands, when she thought no one was watching, were not entirely steady. Clem began gathering information through the network of relationships he had built over 7 years of running the only well-stocked mercantile within 20 miles, which was to say through nearly every person who passed through Stone Creek for any purpose. What he learned over the course of several days was not comforting. The territorial judge who had issued Bernard Weston's warrant was, according to Holt's telegrams with colleagues in Helena, currently under investigation by federal authorities for accepting payments in exchange for favorable legal documents in at least 11 documented cases. The warrant Bernard had produced might be genuine in its appearance. It was not genuine in its origin. And Fletcher, the quiet professional, had been doing something other than standing quietly beside his employer. He had been walking the perimeter of Stone Creek and its surroundings with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting a survey. He had been seen with a small notebook making notes in a hand too small to read at any distance. Clem brought all of this back to the ranch on a Thursday evening and laid it before his brothers in the kitchen after supper. He laid it out carefully in order the way you lay out evidence when you want to be certain it is understood. Silas listened to all of it without speaking. His face gave nothing away. He had spent 3 years training his face not to give things away, and the training was thorough. When Clem finished, Silas asked one question. What does this man actually want? Clem told him what Winnie had shared in pieces over several conversations. Bernard Weston was not a man pursuing justice. He was a man who did not accept refusal, a man who had understood the power he held over the people who depended on him for their livelihoods, who had used that power in a specific way toward a specific person who had been refused, and who had treated that refusal not as a limit to be respected, but as a problem to be solved. He had crossed 1,700 miles of winter country to solve it. Something happened in Silas Harrow's eyes. It was not visible in the way that visible things are visible. It did not move the surface of his face, but it was there in the quality of his gaze, a shift from the flat distance that had lived in his expression for 3 years to something older and deeper and more fundamental than grief. Something that did not require thought or deliberation because it operated below both. The part of a man that decides certain things are not acceptable and does not need reasons to explain why. He is not taking her, Silas said. Clem noted with the careful attention of someone who had been watching his brother for 3 years and had learned to read the signals that most people missed that Silas did not say taking her back. He said taking her. The distinction was small. It was also not small. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge and found the gap in the logs it always found, and it made its familiar sound through that gap. The fire in the main room burned steadily. The carved wooden hawk on Winnie's windowsill caught the last of the evening light through the glass. Something was building towards something else. Winnie in her room pressed her hand against the velvet pouch she wore against her chest every day. She could feel the letter inside it through the fabric, its precise and finite weight, the weight of a thing that has been carried long enough to become part of the body's awareness of itself. She had come 2,000 miles on a promise that turned out to be a lie. She had not yet begun to understand that it was also turning out to be the truest thing that had ever happened to her. But the mountains outside were beginning their long, slow preparation for spring, and spring in Wyoming territory was the season when things that had been frozen for a long time began to move again. That season was almost here. Reed Harrow came down from the high country at a hard gallop on a Thursday morning, pushing his horse in a way that his brothers had never seen him push an animal because Reed treated his horses with the patient respect of someone who understood the cost of carelessness. The horse was lathered despite the cold. Reed's face when he swung down before the animal had fully stopped wore an expression that both his brothers recognized without requiring explanation. It was the expression he wore when the mountain was about to try to kill them. "Storm coming," he said, his breath fogging in the frozen air. "The worst I have seen this year. We have hours, not days." He had read the signs that most men do not know how to read because most men do not spend enough time at altitude to learn the mountain's particular language. The clouds stacking in the northwest 2 shades darker than their altitude warranted. The wind shifting direction 3 times in the space of 1 hour, indecisive in that particular way when something large is organizing itself. The elk herd moving downhill from the high meadows at a pace that spoke of urgency rather than ordinary migration. And the taste of the air metallic and sharp, Taste that came before the worst blizzards, the ones that arrived not as weather but as something closer to intention. Silas took command immediately with the short, precise authority of a man born to manage emergencies. Clem would push every head of cattle he could locate toward the lower shelter before the road became impassable. Reed would go to the barn, seal every gap in the roof, pack the interior with extra hay against the cold that was coming. Silas would handle firewood and water. Winnie appeared in the doorway of the main house dressed in her heavy wool coat and with her hair tied back and her face set in the expression she wore when she had made a decision and was not interested in discussing whether the decision was advisable. "What can I do?" she said. Silas looked at her. He had been about to say stay inside. He had the words ready, and then he looked at the set of her jaw, the particular angle of her chin, the expression that he recognized now because he had seen it on the frozen main street of Stone Creek on the morning of her arrival when she had been shaking with cold and humiliation and had still managed that small, deliberate lift of the head that said something fundamental about the person underneath the circumstances. "Water," he said. "Fill every container in the house before the creek freezes solid. The buckets are in the shed." She went without another word. She hauled water. 12 trips from the creek behind the ranch house to the kitchen, each bucket heavier than she had anticipated, the handle biting into her palms through her gloves, the cold attacking from every direction with the focused intent of something that has identified a weakness. By the 6th trip, her hands were raw. By the 10th, the skin at the base of her fingers had split open and the bucket handles were dark where her palms had pressed against them. She did not stop. She did not come inside to show anyone. She filled every pot, every basin, every vessel in the kitchen that could hold water, and then she went to find more containers. Reed was coming out of the barn when she made her last trip, carrying the final bucket with both hands, her body leaning forward against the weight of it, her small frame throwing everything it had into the task. He saw her hands. He saw the blood on the handle where she had gripped it. He watched her set the bucket down on the kitchen step and flex her fingers once against the cold and the pain, and then pick it up again and carry it inside. He did not say anything to her. He did not say anything to anyone. But something in him changed in that moment in a way that did not change back. Some shifts are permanent, not provisional, not subject to revision. From that moment when Reed spoke to his brothers about her, he used her name. The storm struck the ridge an hour earlier than Reed had predicted, which said something about the storm that Reed, who was better at reading weather than anyone in the valley, did not take lightly. The world turned white in the span of 15 minutes. Visibility dropped to the length of a horse. The temperature fell with a speed that was almost physical, a sensation of the air hardening around any exposed surface claiming it. Silas had ridden higher on the ridge to retrieve 2 steers that had found a sheltered draw and settled into it with the stubborn immobility of cattle who have decided they are comfortable and see no reason to reassess that decision. He had nearly gotten them moving when the full force of the blizzard descended on the mountain like something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The road back to the ranch was gone, not impassable, gone, replaced by a moving white wall that offered no landmarks, no direction, no reference point. A man who did not know this mountain would have died on that ridge. Silas had grown up on this mountain. He knew it the way he knew the grain of leather under his working thumb, every feature memorized through years of contact. Half a mile above him, on a sheltered ledge of rock that the prevailing wind could not reach directly, sat one of the line cabins. A single room 12 feet across, a cast iron stove, a cot. Supplies enough for a week if a man was careful. He reached it. He got his horse into the lean-to on the windward side. He barricaded the cabin door against the force of the storm and built a fire in the stove and sat in the small circle of warmth while the mountain tried to dismantle the structure around him. And the ghost found him. He had ridden past his cabin 3 years ago, going in the opposite direction, pushing down through the dark toward Stone Creek, toward Dock Marsh, toward help that came too late. The storm that night had sounded like this one. The wind on this mountain in a storm this size made the same sound it had made the night Hannah died, and the cabin sat on the same trail he had ridden that night, and 20 hours of darkness and wind and cold gave the memories every opening they needed. 20 hours in the cabin. 20 hours with the sound of the wind as his only company, and the wind on this mountain in a storm this size sounded like everything he had ever lost, grieving at the highest possible volume. At Harrow's Ridge, Winnie stood at the kitchen window with her bandaged hands pressed flat against the cold glass and stared into the white wall of the storm until she could not distinguish the storm from the mountain from the sky. Clem sat at the kitchen table and said things that were meant to be reassuring about Silas knowing the mountain, about the line cabin, about men who have been caught in worse weather and come through it. His hands were wrapped around a coffee cup he was not drinking from. The knuckles were white. Reed did not sit. He paced the length of the kitchen in a path that wore itself into the same trajectory over and over, back and forth, across the floorboards, his body vibrating with the frustrated energy of a man who has spent his life acting on information and who is now in possession of information he cannot act on because riding into that storm was not courage. It was suicide, and he knew it, and he paced anyway. The storm lasted a full day and night. When the wind dropped from catastrophic to merely severe before the last gust had finished echoing off the ridge walls, Reed was already at the barn. He had the saddle on before Winnie reached the barn door. She was wearing every piece of warm clothing she owned. The layers of it gave her a slightly broader silhouette than usual, which was her starting point for any outdoor enterprise. Her face was raw from cold despite the scarf she had wound around it. Her blue eyes above that scarf were completely steady. "I am coming," she said. Reed looked at her for a long moment with the assessing green hazel eyes that had been reading terrain for signs of significance since he was old enough to ride. He saw in her eyes what he recognized because he carried it himself. The absolute refusal to remain in safety while someone she cared about might need to be found. The refusal that was not bravery in the performed sense, but something more fundamental, the simple inability to do the other thing, to stay behind, to wait. He gave her a single sharp nod. They rode out into the white silence of the aftermath together. Reed found Silas's tracks within the first mile, reading the snow the way other men read a printed page, moving his eyes across it, with the focused attention of someone to whom the information was entirely legible. The depth of each hoofprint, the spacing, the way the stride shortened and then lengthened. He narrated it in the spare way he narrated everything, only what was essential. Started strong, rest here, then continued. Cold taking hold from this point on. Wind shifted on him here, he adjusted direction. He indicated a place where the tracks curved slightly. He knew where he was going. 2 miles up the story and the snow changed. Silas's tracks ended at the cabin, the horse's hoofprints leading around to the lean-to shelter on the protected side. Winnie pushed through the cabin door first because she was off her horse before Reed had fully stopped his moving, with a speed that surprised her as much as it surprised him. Silas looked up from the stove where he had been feeding the last of the firewood. In the first fraction of a second before any of his defenses could reconstruct themselves, before he could arrange his face back into the expression he had worn for 3 years, his face said everything. The fear that he had been holding through 20 hours in the cabin was visible. The gratitude was visible. And something else was visible. The expression of a man who has looked up and seen the specific person he most needed to see, and whose face, before he can prevent it, shows what that means. "You should not have come," he said roughly. "The conditions are not safe. You should not have been up here alone," Winnie said. Reed looked at both of them for a moment. Then he turned his horse back toward the ranch. He would tell Clem that Silas was alive. He did not explain why he was leaving the two of them at the cabin instead of bringing Silas back immediately. The trail was unstable. They would need to wait until morning for safe passage. These were the practical reasons, and they were true. They were not the only reasons. Some things do not require explanation. Some things need to be left alone to happen. The evening was practical at first. There was always something practical to occupy the first hours of a situation like this one. Silas fed the stove. Winnie found the supplies and made a simple meal. They hung their outer clothes near the heat to dry. The rhythm of necessary tasks filled the space between them with something manageable. But the tasks ran out. The fire settled into its steady work. Outside, the wind found the long, low register it finds after a storm has spent its worst not attacking any more morning. The sound of it against the cabin walls was the sound it always made. It was the sound it had made the night Hannah died. They sat on opposite sides of the small stove. Silas worked a length of bridle leather that had snapped during the ride, his hands moving through the repair by the muscle memory of 20 years. Winnie mended a tear in her coat sleeve with the small, neat stitches of her particular training. They worked without speaking. The fire between them. The wind outside. The small, rhythmic sounds of two people repairing things that were broken. Then Silas's hands began to shake. Not much. Just enough to make the needle miss the hole it was aimed for. He looked down at his own hands with an expression that was entirely private. The expression of a man whose body has produced a mutiny at an inconvenient moment, a quiet fury at the impossibility of controlling the one thing you are supposed to be able to control. Winnie set down her mending. She reached across the narrow space between them and placed her hand over his. Her hand was small. It covered perhaps a third of his palm. She did not squeeze it. She did not pat it. She did not say anything at all. She placed her hand there and held it completely still with the specific quality of stillness that comes from understanding that what is needed is not action, but presence. Not fixing. Being. Silas looked down at her hand on his. He did not pull away. Outside, the wind found the gap in the cabin logs and made it sound through it, the long, low moan that rose and fell like something breathing. It sounded with an exactness that had no right to exist, like the wind on this same mountain on the night that had ended everything. Hannah died on this trail, he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the door, at the darkness behind it, at the distance between now and 3 years ago. His voice was rough and quiet, the voice of a man speaking to himself as much as to anyone working something through. Not here, but on this trail. The night the baby came, I rode out for Doc Marsh. The storm hit while I was on the ridge. I could not get through. By the time I got back, it was already. He stopped. The fire moved between them. His jaw worked. 4 hours. The baby lived 4 hours. Long enough for Hannah to hold her. Long enough to give her a name. He stopped again. The word came alone into the firelit air of the cabin, Faith. Faith is a beautiful name, Winnie said. That was all. She did not say she was sorry, though she was. She did not say it would be all right. She said the name was beautiful, and she kept her hand on his, and she waited, because some things cannot be carried by words, and some people understand this without having to be taught. Silas drew a breath from deep in his chest. It came out in a long, shuddering exhalation. Not a sob, not a cry, something quieter and more fundamental than either. The sound of a man who has been holding his breath for 3 years and has finally been compelled by circumstances and exhaustion and the particular patience of the woman sitting across from him to let it go. His hand turned under hers. His fingers closed around her palm. He held on. They sat in the firelight while the wind grieved outside the cabin walls, and they did not need to say anything more, because some things are too large for language and can only be held in silence between two people who both understand the weight of what they are holding. They fell asleep sitting up. Winnie's head came to rest against his shoulder. His arm came around her not as a declaration, but as something more automatic than declaration, the instinctive warmth of one body toward another when the cold is outside and the fire is low and the night is very long. They were not lovers. They were two people who had found against the odds and, against both their expressed intentions, someone who understood. When morning came, the trail was passable. They rode back to the ranch in silence. But it was a different silence from the silence they had ridden out in. Warmer, less empty. The silence of two people who have shared something that cannot be taken back and who are not yet sure what to do with that, but who know that the before and the after are no longer the same place. The weeks that followed the cabin were a private torment for Silas Harrow. He was awake now, painfully, exquisitely, miserably awake, in the way of a man whose numbness has worn away, who is rediscovering the full range of sensation after years of careful anesthesia, and who is discovering that sensation in its full range, but includes things he had specifically arranged not to feel. He noticed everything about Winnie. The way she hummed while she worked in the kitchen, slightly off-key, never seeming to notice, never seeming to care. The way she caught her toe on the third stair every single morning and laughed every single time, as though the stair's existence as an obstacle was a reliable source of fresh comedy rather than an ongoing structural problem. The way she had made his house smell like a place where someone wanted to be. He was falling in love with her. The realization arrived not with drama, but with the slow, inexorable certainty of something that has been true for longer than it has been acknowledged. And it brought immediately behind it the full weight of everything he had been protecting himself against. Because loving Winnie meant the possibility of losing Winnie. The equation that 3 years of grief had written into him was simple and devastating and unchanged by any of the events of the past several weeks. Love equaled loss. That was the only arithmetic his pain knew how to perform. He retreated, not all at once, gradually one step and then another until the distance felt manageable again. He became cold and careful in his interactions with her, correct and measured in every exchange present, without being available. He ate quickly and returned to his shop. He avoided the main room in the evenings. He avoided looking at her directly because looking at her directly was something he had stopped trusting himself to do safely. When he noticed the withdrawal immediately with the particular acuity of a woman who had been paying close attention. She gave him space with a patience that cost her more than it showed the patience of someone who has learned through experience to hold what she values loosely rather than risk losing it by gripping too hard. But the hurt that moved across her face each time he retreated, the small, careful wound of it cut Silas more deeply than any argument could have, because it was entirely honest and entirely unperformed. He caught her watching him at supper on a Wednesday evening, and what he saw in her face before she looked away was not accusation or anger. It was the expression of someone who had learned to expect less than they deserved and had been doing it for so long that the adjustment was almost automatic. It was the expression that finally brought Clem to the workshop on a Thursday afternoon to say what needed saying. Clem stood in the workshop doorway while Silas worked leather with a force that had no productive purpose, and he said the things that only a brother can say, the things that require the specific credential of having been present for the whole story. She thinks she has done something wrong, Clem said. She rode through the aftermath of a blizzard to find you. She has made this house into a home again without being asked. She carries something against her chest every day that she has never shown to anyone, and whatever it has been keeping her company since before she came here. And you are retreating from her because you are afraid. Silas set down the awl in his hand, carefully. What if I lose her, he said. It was not a question, it was the shape of the fear named out loud for the first time. What if you are already losing her, Clem said, by doing nothing? The map arrived 2 days later, not in a dramatic fashion. It arrived the way most dangerous things arrive, quietly and without announcement when the moment is not prepared for it. Clem had gotten it through a regular customer, a man named Pickett, who worked evenings at the saloon and who had found it on the floor near the table where Greer had been drinking. Greer had apparently made the mistake of falling asleep at the table and leaving his coat over the back of the chair. The chair, in the folded paper, had worked its way out of the interior pocket and onto the floor where Pickett had picked it up to set it on the table, and then, being a man of more curiosity than average, had unfolded it before putting it back. He had brought it to Clem because Clem was the person in Stone Creek whom people brought things to when they were not sure what to do with them. Clem laid it on the kitchen table. Winnie had come into the kitchen looking for her coat before anyone could move it, and she saw it before anyone could redirect her attention. She picked it up. She looked at it. She looked at it long enough to understand what she was looking at: the outlines of the ranch house. Every door and window marked the barn and the workshop, and the sight lines from the tree line at the edge of the property, all of it rendered in the neat, precise hand of someone who had studied the place with professional thoroughness. And in the corner, in small, careful lettering, bedroom, second floor, second window from left. Her hands were shaking by the time she finished reading it. Not from cold, she understood everything. The Harrow family was in danger because of her presence. This house, which Silas had built with his own hands for a life he had intended to build here, was being surveilled by a man who had never in his life accepted the word no. Fletcher had not been taking notes on the scenery. He had been building a plan, and the plan was not a legal one. Everything that had happened since her arrival, every meal in that kitchen, every evening by that fire, every small and careful step towards something she had not allowed herself to fully name, had brought danger to the people who had, against their own better judgment and at considerable personal cost, taken her in. She had been the problem in every room she had occupied for the past 6 years. She made her decision in the quiet manner. She made all her decisions alone, without ceremony. She packed the lightest of her trunks before the house settled into sleep. She left Penelope in the cage with extra food and the by position near the bank stove because she could not carry a bird through knee-deep snow, and Penelope deserved warmth regardless of what Winnie deserved. She left the carved wooden figures on the windowsill in her room. The hawk and the horse and the rabbit and the wildflower lined up in the order they had arrived because they belonged to this house more than they belonged to her. On the pillow of the spare room, she left a sheet of paper folded once. "I will not let him hurt you because of me." Please take care of Penelope. She likes to be read to in the evenings, especially stories with a proper villain, as it gives her material. Thank you for everything, especially the laughter. That was the best thing I will carry from here. She did not sign it with anything but her name. She went out the back door at 2 in the morning, pulling the trunk behind her, heading south toward the main road. The snow was knee-deep in the open and hip-deep in the drifts. The cold was the kind that gets inside the lungs and makes breathing feel like work. The stars were out, brilliant and indifferent, and the mountain rose on every side of her, beautiful and absolutely unconcerned with her situation. She walked. Silas woke at first light knowing something was wrong before he could identify what. It was not a sound, it was the quality of the silence. The house had been silent for 3 years before Winnie arrived, and he had stopped noticing. This was the old silence. The silence from before. It had a different weight. He went to the door of the spare room. Open. The bed made with the careful thoroughness of someone who does things completely when they do them. The trunk gone. The clothes gone. The wooden figures on the windowsill still in their row, catching the early light. The folded paper on the pillow. He picked it up. His hands were unsteady in a way they had not been since the night he had dug a grave in frozen ground and could not feel his feet by the time he finished. He read it. He read it again. Clem appeared in the doorway behind him. He saw the empty room. He saw the trunk gone and the note in his brother's hands. He did not speak. He looked at Silas's face and he understood everything that needed to be understood. What he saw in his brother's face was not the grief he had been watching for 3 years. That grief he knew. He could read it the way read weather, by its specific quality, by what it did to the set of the eyes and the line of the jaw. This was different. This was the expression of a man who has been forced by circumstances beyond his management to understand with complete and unambiguous clarity exactly what he is about to lose. I love her, Clem. The words came out roughly, without preamble. I have been so afraid of losing someone again that I pushed away the only person who has made me want to get up in the morning. I know. I let her go once. He was already reaching for his coat, already moving. I sat in a cabin while she came through a mountain storm to find me, and I let her walk back into the cold feeling like she had done something wrong. I will not do that again. Reed was in the hall when Silas came out of the room. His coat was already on. His rifle was slung across his shoulder. His green hazel eyes held the expression he wore when he was tracking something that mattered, focused and entirely certain of direction. He said nothing. The look he gave his brother carried everything it needed to carry. 3 brothers rode out into the mountain morning side by side. Their horses' breath rose in the cold air. Their hoofbeats broke through the night's fresh crust of ice on the snow. The sky was the pale gray of early morning at altitude, the kind of gray that precedes the light rather than following the dark. For the first time in 3 years, the Harrow brothers moved together with a shared purpose. It was not grief. It was not the grim, mechanical continuation of a life that had lost its direction. It was hope, desperate and ferocious and absolutely unwilling to wait. Reed found her trail within the first mile. He narrated it in the spare language of someone reading a text, calling out what he saw as he saw it. Started strong. Trunk furrow is deep here, fresh cut. She went straight south. Rested around here, compression pattern. Picked up again, stride shortening from here on, getting cold. 2 miles from the ranch, the trail told a story that made Clem set his jaw and made Silas drive his heels into his horse's flanks. The footprints had become erratic. They wandered slightly, corrected, wandered again. Then they stopped entirely at a place where the snow bore the deep body-shaped compression of someone who had gone down and stayed down long enough to pack the snow beneath them. And then somehow the trail continued. She fell, Reed said, and his voice carried something that had not been in his voice when he described the tracks in the first mile. Not surprise, recognition. She was down a long time, and she got back up. He looked at the continuing peril in the snow. He said nothing further, but the set of his face said that he had just revised some assessment he had been maintaining about the person who had made these tracks. They found her at the junction of the ranch trail and the main road 5 miles from Harrow's Ridge. She was sitting on her trunk in the snow. Her arms were wrapped around herself. Her face was raw and red from cold wet from crying. Not the careful tears she had shed privately. in rooms where no one could see her, but the hard, ugly, unguarded tears of a woman who has used up every reserve she was carrying and has arrived at the bottom of the inventory. Her gloves were dark, where her split palms had reopened against the trunk handles through the night. Her lips were pale. Her whole body was shaking with the deep involuntary tremors that come when the core temperature has been negotiating with the limits for too long. She had been walking for more than 4 hours. She had made 5 miles through post-blizzard conditions that would have stopped many men. She had approximately 22 more to go before reaching the nearest stage stop. And she was sitting on her trunk in the snow because some part of her, the rational part that had been running the calculations since Philadelphia, had finished the arithmetic and found the numbers did not add up. When she heard the horses and looked up and saw 3 riders coming toward her through the pale morning light, her face did something that Silas would carry with him for the rest of his life. It collapsed. All of it, all the composure and the bravery, and the particular kind of steel that had kept her upright through 6 weeks in a dead woman's house and a false man's accusations, and 5 miles of frozen darkness, gave way at once completely, with the total surrender of a structure that has been holding against too much for too long. She put her face in her bloody hands and wept the way people weep when they have nothing left to protect. She tried to stand when they reached her. She made it to her feet. For approximately 2 seconds, she held the position. Then her boot caught the corner of the trunk, and she stumbled and caught herself on one knee and stood again and stumbled again and sat back down in the snow in the graceless, involuntary way of someone who has nothing left for balance. Even now, even sitting in the snow after 4 hours in the dark and all the reserve she had, she could not cross 5 feet of flat ground without tripping over something. Silas dismounted. He walked toward her through the snow, not running, walking, with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who wants to be seen coming, who wants every step to be understood as a choice, as something he is doing because he has decided to do it and not for any other reason. He knelt in front of her in the snow so they were level, eye to eye. "Come home," he said. "I cannot." Her voice was rough from cold and crying. "Bernard will hurt you. He has a map of the house. He has a man who knows which window is my room. Everything that is happening is because of me, and I will not." "Bernard Weston," Silas said, and his voice had the quality of something decided rather than something hoped for, "will have to go through me and my brothers and every honest person in Stone Creek before he gets within reach of you." A pause. "And after all of that, he will still have to deal with Penelope." The sound Winnie made was half laugh and half sob, broken and desperate and entirely unguarded, the most completely human sound Silas had heard from her from anyone in 3 years. "That is not funny," she said. "I know, but you almost smiled, and I have discovered recently that I will say almost anything in order to make that happen." He held her eyes. He let her look at what was in his. All of it, the full unguarded truth of it, without the distance he had been maintaining, without the careful management that had kept him safe and alone for 3 years. "Come home, Winnie, please." She searched his face for a long moment. Whatever she found there was sufficient. She nodded. He lifted her from the trunk and onto his horse as though the effort involved was nothing, because for him, it was nothing, and then he mounted behind her and wrapped his coat around both of them. She leaned back against his chest. He felt the shaking in her ease as his warmth reached her. Her head came to rest on his shoulder, and her eyes closed. They brought her trunk home. They brought Winnie home. And the house, which had felt wrong since before dawn, felt right again by noon. And if Silas noticed the difference, which he did, he said nothing about it, because saying something about it would require acknowledging what the house had become to him and what Winnie had become to him, and he was not quite ready to say those things out loud. Not yet. He was getting closer. The reckoning with Bernard Weston came 2 days later, in the way that these things come in small frontier towns publicly, and with the whole community watching and everyone understanding that what happens in the next hour will define something about who they are as a place. It came because Greer made a mistake on a Wednesday afternoon outside Ruth Langley's general store. He stepped out from the side of the building and took hold of Winnie's arm as she was leaving with a basket of goods, his grip tight enough to leave marks, his breath carrying the signature of the saloon at midday. "Mr. Weston wants a word," he said, "and he is done being patient about it." Greer did not finish the sentence. Reed came out of the mercantile doorway across the street with the silent ground-covering speed of a man whose life has been spent covering ground silently. He covered the distance between himself and Greer in the time it takes to blink. His hand closed around Greer's wrist and applied a precise practiced torsion that communicated through the language of applied force exactly what the consequence of maintaining the grip would be. Greer released Winnie's arm with a sound that the horses on the street found sufficiently alarming. Reed held the twisted wrist and leaned close. His green hazel eyes were flat and calm in the particular way that is more alarming than visible anger, because visible anger shows you its limits, and this showed none. "Touch her again," Reed said at the volume of a private conversation, "and I will walk you into those mountains and leave you there. They will not find you until spring." He paused one beat. Maybe not even then. Greer retreated toward the saloon at a pace that suggested he had revised his professional assessment of the situation. Reed let him go. Winnie touched Reed's arm. He looked at her for a moment, the direct look of a man who has decided to stop maintaining a particular distance, and whatever passed between them in that moment required no words and did not use any. "Stop walking around town without one of us," Reed said. "You are terrible at looking after yourself." "I am," she agreed, and her smile was thin but entirely real. Bernard came out of the saloon within the hour, his patience finished, his polish cracked at the edges, in the way that polish cracks when the thing underneath it has been subjected to enough pressure. He planted himself in the center of Stone Creek's main street and demanded that Sheriff Holt enforce his warrant immediately. The whole town came to watch. Word moved through small communities at the speed that only genuine events produce, events that people understand instinctively will be talked about for years. They lined the boardwalks and filled the doorways and stood in the frozen mud of the street, and they watched. The three Harrow brothers stood together in the street for the first time in 3 years. Silas in the center, Clem to his left, Reed to his right, Winnie behind them, which was where she had been placed not by instruction, but by the natural geometry of 3 men who had made a decision. 3 men, each standing over 6 feet, built by the particular physical requirements of frontier life, shoulder to shoulder in the cold morning air. Between them and the man who had come to take what he had decided was his. Sheriff Harlan Holt walked into the space between the two parties with the measured pace of a man who has commanded soldiers and who understands that real authority does not require volume or speed. He dismantled Bernard Weston's case with the quiet thoroughness of a man who had been doing his work while Bernard had been buying drinks. The warrant issued by a territorial judge in Helena, who was currently under active federal investigation for accepting payment in exchange for favorable legal documents in 11 documented cases. The warrant was purchased, not earned. The brooch Winnie was carrying, a letter from Margaret Weston herself obtained through intermediaries and authenticated through Holt's contacts in Philadelphia, confirming that the diamond brooch had been a gift given freely and without condition. Not stolen, given. The motive 3 witnesses from the saloon were prepared to confirm statements Greer had made while intoxicated on multiple evenings, statements that collectively described an employer not pursuing stolen property, but pursuing a person who had refused him. "Mr. Weston," Holt said, and his voice carried to every person on that street without effort, "your warrant is fraudulent. Your charges are false. Your man assaulted a woman on my street this morning. You have 24 hours to leave Stone Creek. If you are still within the limits of this town when the sun comes up tomorrow, I will arrest you for filing false charges, intimidation, and conspiracy. Do I make myself understood?" The mask broke, not gradually. Bernard Weston's carefully maintained presentation. The reasonable man, the wronged husband, the seeker of justice, cracked and fell away with the completeness of a structure that has been undermined at every support point simultaneously. What emerged was ugly and honest and personal, the face of a man who has spent his life using power over people who could not resist it and who has arrived somewhere he cannot manage and does not know what to do about that. His eyes found Winnie behind the wall of Harrow brothers. He said things. The things he said were the kind that reveal more about the person saying them than the person they are aimed at. He said she was nothing. He said she had always been nothing. He said the mountain men she thought could protect her were nothing. Silas stepped forward. He moved with the slow, inevitable geological quality of something that has weight and direction and is not particularly interested in being diverted. He placed himself between Bernard and Winnie, and he looked down at the smaller man from the height advantage nature had given him And when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that the people at the edges of the crowd had to lean forward. "Her name is Winifred Ashford," he said. "She is not nothing. She is the woman who taught a dead man how to live again. And if you say otherwise one more time, I will forget that I am standing in front of witnesses." Bernard Weston looked up into Silas Harrow's amber eyes. What he saw there was not anger. Anger was something he understood. He had managed angry men before. What he thought was something colder and more absolute than anger. The settled, unargued certainty of a man who has already lost everything he loved and who has therefore already answered the question of what he is willing to risk. Fletcher had been watching the entire situation with the professional attention of someone whose survival has depended on accurate threat assessment. He looked at the three brothers. He looked at Holt's hand on his revolver. He looked at Ruth Langley in the doorway of her store with a 12-gauge shotgun cradled in her arms with the ease of long familiarity. He looked at the assembled faces of Stone Creek. He took his hand away from his belt. "I am not being paid enough for this," Fletcher said to Bernard with the flat resignation of a man closing a ledger. He walked toward the livery stable. Greer followed him without a word. Bernard Weston stood alone in the middle of the street. His men were gone. His legal instrument was worthless. The town he had attempted to manipulate had turned its face away from him, and the woman he had traveled 1,700 miles to reclaim was standing behind three mountain men and looking at him not with fear, not with anger, but with something far more difficult to receive: pity. He left Stone Creek on the morning stage alone in his expensive luggage. Months later, word came through Holt's network of contacts that Margaret Weston had filed for divorce, that the details of Bernard's conduct had become public record in Philadelphia, and that the man who had wielded money and social position as weapons had been diminished by the exposure of exactly how he had used them. Justice, it turned out, keeps its own schedule. But it keeps it. Silas spent 3 days in his leather shop after Bernard Weston left Stone Creek, and he did not spend them hiding. He worked because his hands needed occupation the way his lungs needed air, and because the rhythm of stitching leather had always been the rhythm in which his mind moved most clearly. He worked on a piece of bridal leather that required no particular attention, and while his hands moved through the familiar motions, he thought. He thought about Hannah. Not the Hannah that grief had constructed over 3 years of absence, the idealized amber-encased version of a woman preserved at her best moment, made luminous by loss. He thought about the real Hannah, the woman who had laughed too loudly at her own jokes and known it and not stopped, who had argued with him about the placement of the south fence line with a stubbornness that matched his degree for degree, who had sung off-key in the kitchen every morning of their 2 years together, and who had known she was off-key, and who had considered this entirely beside the point, who had seen something worth loving in a man who was, by his own accounting, difficult, reserved, and not easy to live alongside, and who had loved it openly and without apology. He would always love Hannah. That was not in question and had never been. It was the bedrock underneath everything else, permanent, not subject to revision by any event or circumstance or length of time. Her name was carved above his fireplace because he had needed it there, because the terror of forgetting her face had been real, and the carving had been his answer to that terror. But he thought about Winnie. He thought about what specifically he loved about Winifred Ashford, and he examined each item with the same precision he brought to assessing the quality of a piece of hide, pressing at it, checking the fiber, looking for weakness or falseness. He loved her clumsiness, not because it reminded him of anyone, not because it filled any gap, because it was so entirely, stubbornly, irreducibly hers, because it was the physical expression of a woman who moved through the world with total commitment and no protective hesitation, who went fully into everything she did and trusted that the consequences, however undignified, could be survived and laughed at. He loved her courage, the steel core inside the small frame, the woman who had hauled water until her palms split and walked 5 miles alone through a mountain night and stood at the top of a staircase and held Reed Harrow's eyes without looking away. He loved that she had spoken to Hannah's name in the dark with tenderness, as though the dead deserved the same consideration as the living. He loved that she had found the cradle in the attic and said nothing to him about it, because she understood that some things a person needs to carry in their own time. He loved that she had demanded to be gone rather than let anyone be hurt on her behalf. And he loved that she had come back when he asked her to. Hannah was the love of his youth. Winnie was the love of his second chance. They were not the same love, and they were not interchangeable, and the existence of one did not diminish the truth of the other. They were two separate realities, both honest, both real, both his. And understanding that naming it clearly to himself for the first time did not make him feel smaller. It made him feel for the first time in 3 years like a whole man. On the evening of the third day, he put down his tools. He went to the main room. He stood at the fireplace. He looked at the beam above it, at the name carved there, in the deep, precise letters of hands that had been shaking the night he cut them. Hannah. He ran his fingers along the letters. He stood there for a long time, not thinking, just standing. The fire burned behind him. The house was quiet around him. Outside, the first signs of spring were showing in the mountain, the snow line retreating a few feet up the ridge, each day the creek running louder as the melt began. Then he picked up his finest carving tool. He cut a wildflower into the wood just below Hannah's name. Small, precise, each petal distinct, the same wildflower that grew in abundance on the ridge above the house. The same one he had carved into the headboard of the cradle that sat in the attic. The same ones that bloomed every summer above the graves of the two people he had buried there. Beside the flower, he cut two words. Always. Hannah. The name stayed, the love stayed, the past stayed, permanent and honored and exactly as it deserved to be. But the thing he had built around his heart, the tomb of it, the fortress he had maintained with such grim discipline for 3 years, he walked out of it now, and he did not look back because looking back would have suggested he was leaving something behind. He was not leaving anything behind. He was carrying it with him, all of it, into what came next. Below the wildflower below, always Hannah. He carved one more name, Winnie, not in smaller letters, not tucked apologetically into a corner. The same depth as the rest, the same careful precision, the same weight of intention behind every cut. Not a replacement, a companion, not a hierarchy, a testament. Two names on a beam above a fire. Two loves held by one heart, both real, both permanent, both true. He wrapped the beam in a length of canvas and pried it carefully from its brackets, handling it the way you handle something that has earned reverence. He carried it on his shoulder across the covered walkway out into the early spring morning and down the road toward Stone Creek. When he was finishing the afternoon lesson, when he pushed through the schoolhouse door with the beam balanced on one shoulder, the children stared with the open, unmediated fascination of people for whom adult behavior is still genuinely mysterious and interesting. When he turned from the blackboard and looked at him, and then at the canvas-wrapped timber he was carrying, and her face cycled through several expressions before settling on the one that was simply waiting. He waited until the last child filed out. Then he carried the beam to the front table and set it down and stepped back and let her see. She looked at the beam. She saw Hannah. She saw the wildflower. She saw always. And below it in wood, still pale with the newness of the cut Winnie. She pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears that she did not try to contain. I did not erase her name, Silas said. His voice was steady because he had spent 3 days arriving at what he was about to say, and the steadiness was genuine. I cannot erase it. I will not. She is part of me, and she always will be. But I added yours, not to replace hers, because my heart has room for both. He looked at her across the table that held the whole of his history. I love Hannah because she was Hannah. I love you because you are you. Two different women, two different loves. Both of them real. Both of them mine. Winnie was crying freely now, not performing it, and not trying to stop it. Will you have me, Winnie, he said, a man with a dead wife's name on his mantelpiece and sawdust in his hair, and a brother who commits mail fraud across state lines out of excessive love, and a youngest brother who speaks primarily through carved wooden animals and single-syllable grunts. He looked at her and let her see all of it. Will you have all of that, knowing I come with the past I will not put down because it made me who I am, and who I am is the man standing in front of you? Winnie opened her mouth to answer. Penelope, who had been observing the proceedings from her cage in the corner of the schoolroom, with the focused proprietary attention of a creature who considers all matters involving her person to be her direct concern, threw her bright head back and screamed at full volume. Hallelujah! The word rang through the empty schoolhouse, with the resonance of a bell struck cleanly bouncing off the wooden walls and the small desks and the chalkboard and filling the room completely in the way that sound fills a space that has been waiting for it. For one full second, neither of them moved. Then Winnie laughed, and then Silas laughed. They stood in the empty schoolroom, laughing together, both of them simultaneously, without deliberation or self-consciousness, the sound of it filling every corner of the room, and neither of them stopping because neither of them wanted to stop. "Is that a yes from the parrot?" Silas asked when he could speak. "That is a yes from me," Winnie said. She moved toward him with enough momentum to stagger him backward into a desk which crashed into the desk behind it, sending a stack of primers sliding to the floor. The globe toppled from its stand and rolled across the room and came to rest precisely against Penelope's cage. Penelope regarded the globe with the serene satisfaction of a creature whose dramatic instincts have once again proven impeccable. Winnie's face was pressed against his chest. Her arms were locked around him with the conviction of someone who has decided on a permanent arrangement and is not interested in renegotiation. Silas held her. His arms, which could wrestle a steer to the ground without particular effort, closed around her with a gentleness that was its own form of strength. He rested his chin on the top of her head, and she fit there exactly there, as though the space had always existed and had simply been waiting to be filled. He kissed her, then carefully, the way a man touches something he has been afraid to reach for, because reaching meant hoping and hoping meant the full weight of risk. But she was here, real and warm and alive in his arms. And when they parted and she looked up at him, her eyes were the clear mountain lake blue they had been on the frozen street of Stone Creek on the morning of her arrival, carrying the same hope they had carried then, but different now, settled and certain, the hope of someone who has found exactly where she belongs and knows it. "I love you, Silas Harrow," she said. "Even though you are grumpy and work too much and still have not fixed the stair I trip on every single morning." "I love you, Winifred Ashford," he said. "And I am never fixing that stair. Watching you trip on it is the best part of my day." They were married in June when the wildflowers covered the mountain slopes in the purple and gold they put on every year without being asked, because that is what mountain wildflowers do. Winnie chose the location, not the chapel in Stone Creek. The ridge above Harrow's Ridge, the ridge where Hannah and Faith were buried, where the light was good in the evenings, and the view of the valley below went on for miles in every direction. She told Silas she wanted to begin their life together in the presence of those who had come before, because they were part of his story and therefore part of hers, and she would not begin a marriage by pretending otherwise. On the morning of the wedding, before the light had fully arrived, Winnie walked alone up the ridge. She carried a bundle of wildflowers, the same ones that grew there in abundance every summer, the ones carved on the cradle's headboard, the ones now cut into the beam above the fireplace. She knelt in the dew-wet grass beside the stone markers and laid the flowers there and held the silence for a long moment. "I promised to take care of him," she said in the quiet, unhurried voice she used when she was speaking to something that mattered and did not need to be performed for anyone. "Not the way you would have. I could never be you, and I would not try. But I will make sure he laughs. I will make sure he knows he is loved. And I will tell our children about you, about Faith, about the woman who loved him first and the life you built together. You will always be part of this family. Always." She did not know that Silas had followed her, that he stood at the edge of the tree line with his hat in his hands listening. When she rose and turned and saw him there, she saw in his face the specific thing she had been quietly and privately hoping for since the night she had stood in his dark kitchen and spoken to a name carved in wood, not just gratitude and not just love, but permission. The particular freedom of a man who has been told by the person who knows best that he is allowed to be happy without guilt. For the ceremony, while the community of Stone Creek assembled on the ridge with the good-natured cheerfulness of people who understand that this particular event is worth the climb, Winnie opened the velvet pouch. She had been carrying it for 6 years, since the day after her father's funeral when she had found it in the cedar box on his desk. She had never opened it in front of another living person, and for 6 years the reason for that had been too raw to examine directly. But standing on the ridge in the June morning with Silas beside her and the wildflowers nodding around them in the light breeze, she opened it. Inside was a letter, folded 4 times, the paper worn soft at the creases from years of being pressed against her heart. The handwriting was her father's, the school teacher's careful copperplate, a hand she had memorized before she was old enough to read. She gave it to Silas. He read it in silence. The letter was addressed to Winnie, written in the year before William Ashford died, when he had known the timeline and had wanted to leave something behind that his daughter could carry. It was not long. It did not need to be long. Her father had been a man who understood that the most important things required very few words. It said, Winnie, my dear, you will find, if you are brave enough, that the world contains people who will love you exactly as you are. Not who they need you to be. Not who would be convenient, but exactly and precisely you in all your glorious clumsiness, in warmth, in stubbornness, in grace. Do not settle for anything less. You are worth the whole of it. All my love, always your father. Silas folded the letter. He held it for a moment, and then he held her hand, and they stood together on the ridge in the early summer light, above the valley, above the groves, above everything that had brought them here. He had found her, as her father had promised someone would, exactly as she was. Clem served as best man and delivered a speech that the people of Stone Creek would refine and retell for decades, improving it with each iteration, because some moments are too good to let accuracy get in the way. He said he would just like to take this opportunity to point out that absolutely none of this, not a single moment of it, would have occurred without him. Specifically without his willingness to commit mail fraud across territorial lines on behalf of a brother who was too stubborn to save himself. He said he considered this his finest hour and his greatest gift to the community of Stone Creek, Wyoming territory, and that he expected appropriate gratitude to be forthcoming at everyone's earliest convenience. The crowd laughed. Silas shook his head. Winnie threw her bouquet directly at Clem's face with the accuracy of a woman who had been planning that particular moment for weeks. Reed stood beside his brothers in a clean shirt that he wore with the visible discomfort of a man being slowly strangled by social obligation. His gift to the couple was a wooden box with Winnie's initials carved into the lid, and inside, resting on a bed of soft wool, a complete collection of carved animals, horses, cattle, deer, elk, rabbit, hawk, and one magnificently rendered parrot with an expression of imperious satisfaction that was unmistakably Penelope. Months of work, the finest thing his hands had made. When Winnie opened the box and looked at the animals lined up in the wool, she put her face in her hands and wept without any attempt at composure. Reed said with some heat that it was just wood. She wrapped both arms around him with enough force to shift his center of gravity. He stood with his arms at his sides and his jaw working and his eyes unusually bright, and after a moment, one large hand came up and rested briefly on the back of her head. Just for a second. Then he stepped back and cleared his throat and found something at the far edge of the ridge to look at. When the minister reached the portion of the service traditionally reserved for objections, Penelope, whose sense of occasion had always been impeccable, threw her head back and bellowed, "Anchors away," at a volume that scattered birds from the surrounding pines and caused Sheriff Holt to reach for his revolver by pure reflex. The assembled population of Stone Creek dissolved into laughter. The laughter went out across the valley and came back from the mountains, and in it was everything the day contained: joy reclaimed from grief, love rebuilt from loss, a community celebrating the return of one of its own. Silas Harrow laughed louder than anyone. The years that followed were full and noisy and rich with the particular chaos that Winifred Ashford brought to everything she touched, which was considerable because she touched everything, and she touched it with her whole self. She took over the business side of the leather shop and discovered that Silas had been charging less than half of what the market would bear, a fact that produced in her a professional anguish that took several evenings to fully express. She reorganized the pricing and the records and expanded into custom work and commissions, and the business grew in ways it had never managed before because Silas was a craftsman without peer, and Winnie was a natural organizer who had been waiting her whole life for something worth organizing, and together they were something that neither could have been alone. Silas taught Winnie to ride. She fell off 11 times. Clem maintained a tally on a chalkboard behind the mercantile counter that became a minor institution in Stone Creek, with opinions forming among the regulars about whether she would reach 15 before achieving competence. She did not reach 15. On the 12th attempt, through a combination of will and a physical adjustment that seemed to arrive without warning, she found the center of balance and did not lose it again. The sight of her riding beside Silas through the mountain trails, small against his considerable height, her hair loose in the wind, her face carrying the expression of someone who has conquered something that genuinely tried to defeat her, became one of the most familiar and most loved images in the valley. Her clumsiness remained entirely undimmed by matrimony. She knocked over the Christmas tree on its first evening, standing in the house a fall of such total completeness that Reed, who was present, sat down on the floor and did not get up for some time. She dropped a pie face down on the kitchen floor during Doc Marsh's first dinner visit, and Doc Marsh ate the portion that retained structural integrity and declared it the finest she had tasted in Wyoming. The screen door on the front porch was removed after Winnie walked into it so consistently over such an extended period that Silas announced it constituted a greater hazard to public safety than the wolf activity being reported on the upper ridge. Silas caught her every time, or helped her up, or cleaned up the broken pieces, or most often simply laughed deep and full and free, the laugh that had been absent from that house for 3 years and that now lived there permanently because Winnie Ashford Harrow was a one-woman natural disaster, and Silas had discovered, to his considerable and somewhat sheepish surprise, that this was exactly what he had needed all along. Reed changed more than anyone expected. He still disappeared into the high country for days at a stretch. He still communicated with the economy of a man for whom words are a scarce resource to be spent carefully. But he came home more often than he had before, and he ate dinner at the table with the family, and his carvings grew in ambition and beauty as the years passed, moving from animals to landscapes, to intricate small puzzles that the children who came later would spend hours working through. When Winnie told them she was expecting their first child, Reed was the first one in the barn beginning to build furniture for the nursery, and the expression on his face when he thought no one was watching was one of unguarded happiness, so complete that Winnie, seeing it through the barn window, had to sit down on the porch steps because her eyes had gone too blurred to stand safely. The pregnancy frightened Silas in ways he had not fully anticipated. The old fear came back cold and specific. He hovered. He worried. He forbade Winnie from lifting anything heavier than a teacup, which she tolerated for approximately 3 days before informing him that she was having a baby and not made of porcelain, and that if he did not stop following her from room to room, she would lock him in the workshop and slide his meals under the door. Doc Marsh managed everything with professional calm and personal investment. She was there when the labor began. She was prepared for every contingency. And when the baby arrived at dawn, a boy, his cry filling the house and reaching the barn and bringing Reed off the porch steps at a run, Silas held his son for the first time with hands that shook in the specific way of a man managing more feeling than his hands know how to contain. The baby's eyes, when they opened, were the clear blue of his mother's. They named him William Clem Harrow. William for Winnie's father, Clem for the brother whose misguided and magnificent act of love had made all of it possible. When Clem heard the name, he sat down on the porch steps and put his face in his hands and stayed there for a while, and Reed stood beside him and said nothing and looked at the mountains, which was the kindest thing Reed knew how to do. A daughter followed 2 years later. Silas suggested her name, and Winnie accepted it immediately without hesitation. With tears, she did not try to prevent Hannah Rose. The name was not a ghost, it was a bridge. It connected the woman Silas had loved first with the family he was building, with the woman he loved now, and it said in the plainest possible way that there was room for all of it. Room for all the love and all the loss and all the years between them. The beam above the fireplace was updated one more time. Silas carved the 2 new names himself, same depth, in same deliberate hand, and is everything else there. Always. Hannah, Winnie, William, Hannah Rose. 5 names in the wood above the fire. 5 lives held in one story. Not a record of loss, though loss was present in it honestly and permanently. A record of the refusal to let loss be the final word. On a summer evening, many years later, when the house was full of the noise and warmth of a family that had grown in ways neither of them had quite planned for, Silas found Winnie at the kitchen window. She was watching the sunset turn the bighorn peaks to gold and rose the same light that had been making that transformation every evening since long before any of them arrived in the valley, and would be making it long after. The light caught her hair. The years were in her face honestly and without apology, and she was more beautiful to him in that moment than she had been on the frozen main street of Stone Creek on the morning she arrived. Because this was real beauty, the kind that comes from having built something and knowing it. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "How different everything could have been," she said. "If I had not answered the advertisement, if you had sent me away that first morning, if Clem had not done what he did, do you wish it had been different?" She turned in his arms and looked up at him with the blue eyes that had carried too much hope on a February morning, and that now carried something quieter and deeper and more durable than hope. The certainty of a woman who has found exactly where she belongs. "Not for one single moment," she said. She reached up to touch his face. Her elbow caught the vase of wildflowers on the windowsill. The vase fell. It shattered on the wide plank floor, scattering water and flowers across the boards that Silas had sanded smooth enough for bare feet in the summer they were married. Winnie winced. Silas laughed. The deep, full, completely free laugh of a man who has relearned a thing he thought was lost and who finds every day new reasons to be grateful for the lesson. It moved through him the same way it had moved through him on the frozen main street of Stone Creek, on the morning that everything changed from somewhere below, his ribs shaking his shoulders, transforming his face. But some things he said when he could speak never change. Would you want them to? He thought about Ruth Langley's calendar reset to 0 on a February morning. He thought about a note on a pillow that said thank you, especially for the laughter. He thought about the name carved in the beam and the wildflower carved below it and his own name added there beside it and the 4 names that came after. He thought about the cradle that had come down from the attic and now stood in the nursery where it had always been meant to stand occupied at last. He thought about a velvet pouch and a father's letter and the promise it had made kept at last by a woman brave enough to cross a continent on the strength of it. "Not for anything in this world," he said. They kissed in the kitchen while the sunset burned the mountains, and the house hummed with the life they had built around them, the loud and improbable and entirely real life that had begun with a woman falling into a water trough on a winter morning in 1878. And above the fireplace in the light of the evening fire, the beam held its names. Always. Hannah, Winnie, William, Hannah Rose. 5 names in the wood, the full accounting of a man's heart. Not a record of what he had lost. A record of what he had refused to stop carrying and what he had been given in return for that refusal, and the proof written in the patient and precise hand of a craftsman who understood that the things you carve into wood are the things you intend to keep. That a heart is not a container with fixed walls, but a living thing, capable of expanding to hold whatever love is offered to it. All of it true, all of it permanent, all of it in the end the work of a clumsy woman from Boston who arrived in the wrong coat for the weather, fell into a water trough in front of an entire town, and made a mountain man laugh for the first time in 1,014 days.